He took 3 bullets for her company, disarmed 6 armed men with his bare hands, carried her through smoke and broken glass when every trained bodyguard in that building had already run. And when it was finally over, when the sirens came and the cameras turned toward the man who saved her, Victoria Hale looked at Ethan Cole and said 4 words that changed everything. "I know who you are." What she didn't know was that 6 hours earlier, she had signed the termination letter with his name on it. She fired him that morning. He saved her life that night, and neither of them would ever be the same. If this kind of story moves you, the ones about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, then hit that subscribe button right now and join our family here. Every week we bring you powerful cinematic stories that will stay with you long after the last word. Like this video if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. We genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, this one runs deep. The termination letter sat on Victoria Hale's desk at 7:43 in the morning, second from the top of a stack of 11 documents she would sign before her first meeting at 9. It wasn't something she agonized over. The maintenance contract was being restructured, outsourced to a vendor who had submitted a bid 40% lower than the current arrangement. That was the math. That was the decision. Her assistant, Dana, had already flagged the names of the affected employees 3 days ago, and Victoria had reviewed them the way she reviewed most personnel matters, efficiently, without lingering. Ethan Cole, building maintenance supervisor, employed 14 months. She initialed it and moved to the next document. 2 floors below, at that same moment, Ethan was replacing a faulty junction box in the electrical room off the east corridor, his hands already dark with grease before most of the building staff had finished their morning coffee. He worked alone, the way he preferred. The space was tight, crowded with conduit and old wire runs that hadn't been touched in years, and the ventilation was poor, and none of that bothered him at all. He'd worked in tighter spaces. He'd worked in worse. He was 37 years old, built like someone who'd spent years doing things that required his body to be reliable rather than impressive. And he moved through the narrow corridor with the kind of economy that came not from training, but from habit. The habit of a man who had learned not to waste motion when it mattered. His hair had started going gray at the temples. He hadn't done anything about it. There wasn't much point. By 8:15, he had the junction fixed, his tools back in the cart, and a cup of bad vending machine coffee in his hand while he stood outside the building's loading dock, letting the morning air clear the smell of burned insulation from his nose. He called his daughter. She picked up on the second ring. "You're not supposed to call during breakfast." Lily's voice was matter-of-fact, slightly accusing, with that particular 8-year-old authority that tolerated no nonsense. "I know," Ethan said. "I just wanted to make sure you were up." "Mrs. Kowalski made oatmeal." "You like oatmeal." "I like my oatmeal. Hers has raisins." A pause, the sound of a spoon against a bowl. "Are you coming home for dinner?" "Should be. There's a corporate event tonight, so I'll probably need to stick around until 7:30. "Can we watch the nature documentary after?" "Yeah, we can watch the nature documentary." "Okay." Another pause. "Dad?" "What?" "You sound tired." He took a sip of the coffee, which was genuinely terrible. "I'm fine, bud. Eat your oatmeal." "Even the raisins?" "Even the raisins." She made a sound of profound suffering and hung up. Ethan stood there a few seconds longer, watching a delivery truck back into the dock across the alley. Then he finished the coffee, tossed the cup, and went back inside. He found out about the termination at 9:40 from Dana, Victoria Hale's assistant, who appeared at the door of the maintenance office holding an envelope with the careful expression of someone who had delivered this kind of news before and did not enjoy it. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I'm sorry. I really am." He took the envelope, read it standing there at his desk, which was less a desk than a laminate table with a monitor on it, half buried under work orders and parts catalogs. The letter was clean, formal, 3 paragraphs, effective at end of business the following Friday. Severance was included. It was all handled correctly, which in Ethan's experience made it neither better nor worse, just easier to process without argument. "Okay," he said. Dana blinked. "Okay?" "Yeah." He set the letter on the table. "Thanks for bringing it down yourself." She left looking slightly stunned, like she'd been braced for something that hadn't happened. Ethan sat down. He thought about the oatmeal. He thought about the nature documentary. He thought about the stack of bills on the kitchen counter at home, Lily's dental appointment, the after-school program fees, the lease renewal coming up next month. And he did the mental math the way he always did, quickly and without flinching, finding the path through because there was always a path through if you were willing to be honest about the numbers. He'd been through worse. He'd figure it out. He picked up the next work order on his list and went back to work. Victoria Hale had not built a billion-dollar technology company by being careless with time, and she treated the corporate showcase event that evening with the same precision she applied to everything else. The event occupied the top 3 floors of Hale Technologies' flagship building, 40 stories of glass and steel in the financial district, and it had taken 6 weeks to coordinate. 230 guests, investors, partners, journalists, city officials. The kind of crowd that required flawless execution and left no room for error. She stood in front of the mirror in her private office bathroom at 6:15, fixing the collar of her blazer, and she ran through the evening's timeline, the way a pilot runs a pre-flight check. Not because she was anxious, but because that was what professionalism looked like. Every speaker cue, every demo window, every moment when she needed to be in a specific place, shaking a specific hand. She had it mapped. She had contingencies. What she did not have, and what she had never particularly developed, was the ability to see the people who moved around the edges of her world. The maintenance man in the gray uniform, the security guard who worked the East Elevator Bank, the quiet ones who kept the building running while the people with corner offices treated the whole structure as a backdrop. It wasn't cruelty, exactly. It was tunnel vision. She had always been this way, focused to the point of narrowness, able to give anything inside her field of attention an extraordinary level of care while simply not registering what fell outside it. Her therapist had called it a coping mechanism, back when Victoria still had a therapist. She'd stopped going 2 years ago. She didn't have time. Ms. Hale, her head of security, a compact professional man named Greg Ferris, knocked and stepped in without waiting. He'd worked for her 3 years. Guests starting to arrive. Walk through in 10? I'll be right out. He nodded and left. She smoothed her blazer one more time, looked at herself in the mirror, sharp, controlled, ready, and went to meet her evening. Ethan had not gone home. He'd meant to. His shift officially ended at 5, and the letter on his desk technically gave him no reason to stay a minute later than required. But there was a pressure sensor on the 38th floor HVAC system that had been reading inconsistent all day, and he'd logged it as a watch item that morning, and his replacement, whoever that was going to be, was not going to know about it. And if it failed during a 200-person event on a warm October night, the environmental controls on 3 floors would drop out. So he stayed. He was in the mechanical room behind the 38th floor service corridor at 6:40, his tool bag open, running a diagnostic on the sensor array, when he heard the freight elevator engage. That wasn't unusual. The catering team had been using the service entrance all afternoon. What was unusual was that the freight elevator came up empty, and then the people who stepped off it were not carrying trays. Ethan went still. He was behind a half-open metal door, and they didn't see him. There were 4 of them, dressed in event staff uniforms that were slightly wrong in ways that most people would never clock. The logo placement on the shirts, the fit of the pants, the way they moved. They carried cases that looked like catering equipment. They did not look like caterers. They moved with coordination, spacing between them, each one watching a different angle without seeming to. Earpieces. The cases weren't food. Ethan pressed himself against the wall and did not breathe. He had spent 11 years in a career that required him to read environments faster than conscious thought, to look at a room and understand its threat geometry before he could have explained how he knew. He had spent the last 3 years trying to leave that part of himself behind, locking it in a room in his mind and keeping the door shut. The door came open now without permission. He counted what he had: 1 small space, 1 tool bag, 1 maintenance uniform, and the absolute certainty that the people who had just stepped off that elevator were professionals. They were armed, and they were not here for the hors d'oeuvres. He thought about calling building security. He pulled out his phone. No signal. The service corridor was in a dead zone between the cell repeaters. He looked at the tool bag, back at the closed door. He made a decision the way he had always made decisions when the options were bad, not by pretending they were better than they were, but by finding the one that let him live with himself afterward. He left the phone in his pocket and moved. The corporate showcase was everything it was designed to be: sleek, impressive, controlled. Victoria worked the room the way she always did, efficiently and without warmth that could be mistaken for weakness, shaking hands and fielding questions and steering conversations toward the product demonstration scheduled for 8:30. She was good at this. She had never particularly enjoyed it, but good and enjoyable were different things, and she had made peace with that distinction years ago. At 7:15, the evening's energy was exactly where she wanted it. At 7:22, the lights went out on 2 floors simultaneously. Not a flicker. A hard cut, the kind that happens when something is deliberately severed rather than failing. The emergency lighting came on, amber and inadequate. And for about 3 seconds, the room held the particular held-breath silence of a crowd that hasn't decided yet whether to be alarmed. Then the screaming started from the direction of the east corridor. Victoria did not scream. She had never been a screamer, but she felt the thing in her chest that happened when a plan she'd trusted completely revealed a hole she hadn't seen, the lurching, free-fall quality of suddenly having no footing. "Greg!" She grabbed her security chief's arm. "What is this?" Ferris already had his radio up. His expression told her the answer before he spoke. "We have a breach. Multiple—" He stopped, listened, and something shifted in his face that she had never seen before. A man who was good at his job realizing that he was not good enough for what was happening right now. "Ms. Hale, I need you to come with me." "What's happening?" "There are armed individuals on this floor, at least 6. My team is—" Radio burst. He listened. "2 of my people are down. We need to move you." She let him move her. Down the executive corridor toward the private conference room. The fallback point, reinforced door. The plan they'd drilled for situations that were supposed to never happen. Around her, guests were scrambling, voices overlapping, someone crying. The sleek event she'd spent 6 weeks building was dissolving into something she had no framework for, and the thing in her chest wasn't free-fall anymore. It was something colder, something that recognized its own helplessness and didn't know what to do with that. They were 20 feet from the conference room when 3 figures stepped out of the side corridor and blocked the path. Ferris went for his weapon. One of the figures raised something, and Greg Ferris hit the ground. Victoria stared at him. He was still breathing. She could see that, she told herself, she could see that. But he wasn't moving, and the 3 figures were closing the distance, and there were more of them behind her. She could hear them, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria Hale had absolutely nothing. No plan, no leverage, no strategy that applied. "Ms. Hale." The man in front had a flat, neutral voice, the kind that belonged to someone who had done this before. "You're going to come with us now. We can do this without anyone else getting hurt." She didn't move. "Or," he said, "we do it the other way. Let her go." The voice came from the left, from the service door that opened onto the maintenance corridor. A door so unremarkable that none of them had looked at it, because it was the kind of door that existed to be ignored, and the man who stepped through it was the kind of man who had spent his entire career understanding that. I was in a gray uniform. He was carrying, in his right hand, nothing more threatening than a length of conduit pipe that he'd pulled off a wall somewhere in the last 10 minutes. He had grease on his hands and a cut above his left eyebrow that was bleeding freely, and he looked nothing at all like salvation. The man with the flat voice looked at him for a moment and then made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Get out of here," he said. "This doesn't concern you." Ethan Cole looked at him with an expression that wasn't anger or bravado or any of the things that belong on someone's face in the movies when they're about to do something remarkable. It was something quieter than that, something that belonged to a person who had already run the math and found the answer and was simply waiting to begin. "Last chance," Ethan said. The man reached for his weapon. What happened in the next 90 seconds was not clean or elegant or choreographed. It was fast, and it was brutal in the way that real violence is always brutal, sudden and ugly and nothing like the movies, full of sounds that didn't belong in a building like this, in a night like this. Ethan used the pipe, and then he didn't need it anymore. And he used the wall and the door frame and the particular geometry of a corridor that he knew better than anyone in that building, because he had spent 14 months maintaining it, knowing every turn and angle and choke point the way a person knows their own house in the dark. When it was over, Victoria Hale was standing against the wall, and 2 men were on the floor, and Ethan was breathing hard through his nose with blood on his face and someone else's blood on his knuckles, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. "Are you hurt?" he said. She stared at him. "Ms. Hale." His voice was not raised. It was the voice of a man who had discovered a faulty sensor and was reporting the finding. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. No. "Okay." He looked down the corridor. "We need to move. There are at least 4 more on the floor above, and they'll know something's wrong in about 90 seconds. There's a stairwell on the north end that they haven't covered yet." "How do you know they haven't?" "Because if I were running this operation, I wouldn't cover it." He looked back at her. "I know this building. Do you trust me or not?" Victoria Hale was not a person who trusted easily. She had reasons for that, built over years, and she had never considered them a flaw. She looked at this man, the maintenance worker, the one in the gray uniform, the one whose name she had initialed off a termination list 8 hours ago without pausing, and she said, "Yes." "Then stay close and don't stop moving," Ethan said, and he went. She followed. Behind them, from somewhere in the building's upper floors, she could hear shouting. The emergency lighting cast everything amber and strange. Her heels were wrong for this, and she kicked them off after the second turn, running in stockings on cold tile, and the man in front of her moved with a certainty through the building's service corridors that she couldn't account for, that seemed like something more than familiarity. She didn't think about that yet. She thought about keeping up, down 2 flights, through a fire door, into a utility corridor that smelled like the building's bones, old concrete and pipe insulation and something electrical, and then a left, and then a heavy door that Ethan pushed open with his shoulder because he already knew it would stick, and they were in a locked mechanical room with a secondary communications panel on the wall and no other exits. He crossed to the panel, pulled the housing off, and began working. "What are you doing?" Victoria asked. "Getting you a signal. There's a hardline bypass in here that bypasses the main board." His hands moved through the wiring with a confidence that was oddly calming, the way any competence is calming when everything around it is chaos. "Give me 40 seconds. She watched him work. "Who are you?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. His hands kept moving. "My name is Ethan Cole," he said finally. "I work maintenance." "Worked." He pulled 2 wires clear and touched them to a junction block. A panel light came green. Past tense, apparently. She didn't understand that last part, not yet. "Here." He stepped back from the panel. "You've got a signal. Call the police, call your security firm, call whoever you need to call. Tell them the north freight elevator shaft and the east stairwell are compromised. Tell them there are at least 6 hostiles and they're organized." She was already pulling out her phone. "How do you know all of this? How did you—" "Make the calls," he said. He wasn't being unkind. He was being a man who understood that there were things that needed to happen in a specific order and that questions came later. "I'm going to go back out there. There are still people on this floor who need to get to the stairwells." "You're going back out?" "Yes. They have guns." He looked at her steadily. "I know." "That's not—" She stopped herself. The argument forming in her throat was rational and sensible and entirely useless. "At least take this." She pulled off her blazer. Inside the breast pocket was a small emergency radio, a habit from an old security advisor who'd told her to always carry one at large events and whom she had mocked privately and listened to anyway. She held it out. Ethan looked at it for a second, took it. "Thank you," he said. He opened the door and went back into the amber-lit dark, and Victoria Hale stood alone in a mechanical room with her phone in her hand and the sound of her own breathing in her ears and the strange, disorienting sensation of having been saved by the man she'd fired that morning. She dialed 911. While it rang, she thought about the termination letter. She thought about the name she'd initialed past without pausing. Outside, somewhere above her, she heard 3 sharp sounds that were not part of any event she had planned. She pressed the phone harder against her ear and waited. The 911 dispatcher was calm in the way that trained people are calm. Steady, methodical, asking questions in a sequence that had been designed to extract maximum information from people who were not calm at all. Victoria answered everything. Floor numbers, descriptions, last known positions of the hostiles, the condition of Greg Ferris when she'd last seen him. She gave it all in the flat, precise tone of a woman running on adrenaline and discipline. And when the dispatcher told her units were already en route, someone else in the building had managed to call 4 minutes earlier, she felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Then she heard gunfire from the floor above, not the 3 sharp sounds from before. This was different. 2 shots, a pause, Then something that wasn't a gunshot at all, but a crash. Heavy, structural, the sound of something large meeting a wall at speed. She stared at the ceiling of the mechanical room. The dispatcher was saying something about staying in place, staying hidden, not attempting to move until officers were on scene. Victoria stayed on the line. She did not stay in place. She told herself it was practical. There were still people on this floor. She'd seen at least 30 guests scatter into the executive corridor before Ferris went down. And someone needed to know about the north stairwell. Someone needed to be telling them where to go. That was true. It was also true that she pushed open the mechanical room door and moved back into the service corridor because the man who'd gone back into the building with an emergency radio and no weapon was somewhere above her, and she couldn't make herself stand still. The service stairs were narrow and poorly lit, the kind of infrastructure that buildings like this one hid behind drywall and branding. She went up one floor, moving carefully, phone still in hand with the dispatcher's voice a thin thread in her ear. The door to the 39th floor was ajar. She pushed it open slowly. The corridor was empty. Emergency lighting, that same amber wash that made everything look like the end of something. Two of the hostiles' equipment cases were open on the floor near the elevator bank, both empty. She registered that without understanding it fully and kept moving. She found Ethan at the far end of the corridor, crouched beside a man she recognized as one of her junior marketing associates, a kid named Brandon, 24 years old, who had been hired 8 months ago and who was now sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his hands pressed to his left shoulder, breathing in the rapid, shallow way of someone managing pain by not thinking about it directly. Ethan had his shirt cuff pressed against Brandon's shoulder. The cut above Ethan's eye had stopped bleeding and dried dark against his temple. There was a new bruise forming along his jaw that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. "He's okay," Ethan said without looking up at her. "Through and through, didn't hit anything critical. He needs a hospital, but he's stable." "I know him," Victoria said. "Brandon." Brandon looked up at her with the glassy, slightly surprised expression of someone in shock. "Ms. Hale." "Hi." "Hi." She crouched down across from Ethan. "The police are coming. Dispatcher says 4 minutes." "There are 2 more hostiles between here and the main stairwell," Ethan said. "I dealt with 3 on this floor. The other 2 pulled back toward the server room." He looked at her then, and his eyes were the particular flat gray of someone running on something that wasn't quite calm but was trained to look like it. "They're not after money. They went straight for the server room and they know exactly where it is. This wasn't a robbery." Victoria felt the bottom of something drop out. "The server room." "Yeah. That's where the demonstration data is stored. The new system—" She stopped herself. "It's proprietary. There's nothing else on that floor worth—" She stopped again. Ethan was watching her face. "What's in that server room?" he asked. His voice was quiet, direct. The voice of a man who had learned that the quality of information he got depended on asking the question without softening it. "Developmental technology," Victoria said carefully. "Defense-adjacent applications. We've been in talks with—" She glanced at Brandon, who was staring at the floor and clearly trying to appear unconscious. "It's not something I can discuss in detail." "Defense-adjacent," Ethan repeated. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that felt like calculation. "The uniforms they're wearing," he said. "The catering company logo is real. I've seen those guys down here 3 times this month. Whoever planned this had access to vendor information, event scheduling, floor plans." He paused. "They knew the dead zones in your cell coverage. They knew which elevator shafts your security team monitors and which ones they don't." He looked at her steadily. "Someone who works in this building helped them get in." Victoria did not react, or she tried not to. But something in her face must have moved, because Ethan saw it. "You already suspected that," he said. "I suspected a leak," she said. Not something like this." "Tell me later," he said, standing. "Right now I need you to take Brandon and get to the north stairwell. 3rd door on the left, there's a keypad. Override code is 4471. It's a maintenance bypass. Go down to 36 and wait there. The police will come up from the lobby. You're not coming. I need to know what they're taking out of that server room. That's not—" She stood up too. "That's not your job. That's not— You don't work here anymore, technically." Something shifted in his expression, a fraction. "I know," he said. She realized he'd known about the termination. Of course he had. He'd said past tense, apparently in the mechanical room, and she hadn't caught it. and now she understood what he'd meant, and the understanding sat badly in her chest. "Ethan, get Brandon to the stairwell," he said. He looked at her one more time, that steady, unclassifiable look, and then he turned and went down the corridor toward the server room. Victoria watched him go. Then she put her arm under Brandon's and helped him to his feet. "Come on," she said. "Can you walk?" "Yeah." Brandon winced but stood. Is that guy going to be okay?" "I don't know," Victoria said, which was the honest answer. They went to the stairwell. The police arrived 6 minutes later, not 4. In Victoria's experience, most things took longer than people said they would. What Ethan found in the server room was not what he expected, and what he expected had already been bad. He'd moved through the corridor the way he'd moved through 100 environments that required him to know where the danger was before it knew where he was. Not a conscious process, more like a setting that his body switched into without his permission, reading angles and sight lines and the particular quality of silence that meant occupied versus empty. The server room door was standing open. One of the 2 remaining hostiles was inside. The other one was not where Ethan had expected him to be. That was a problem. He registered it a half-second before the man came out of the alcove behind him, and that half-second was the difference between a bad outcome and a survivable one. Ethan turned into the attack instead of away from it, something that went against every instinct a person was born with and only worked if you'd trained yourself past those instincts, and took the impact on his left side instead of his back, and the 2 of them went into the wall together hard enough to crack the drywall. The man was big, trained, and had about 40 pounds on Ethan. In a movie that would have mattered differently. In the server corridor, it meant Ethan had to be specific rather than forceful, and he was 2 precise applications of leverage in quick sequence, using the man's momentum as the mechanism, and then the man was on the floor and staying there, and Ethan's left arm hurt in a way he noted and set aside. He went into the server room. The second hostile was in the process of removing a drive from the secondary rack. Not the primary servers, not the demonstration data, but the backup partition that housed the system's developmental architecture. The deep blueprint, the one that wasn't supposed to exist on a network drive at all. The man saw Ethan. His hand went to his hip. "Don't," Ethan said. The man was calculating. Ethan could see it, the assessment happening behind the eyes, the same rapid math that anyone in that situation ran. He looked at Ethan's size, his bloody face, his empty hands, and he made the wrong call. Ethan crossed the room before the weapon cleared the holster. What happened next was short and unpleasant and left Ethan with 2 additional bruised ribs to add to the list, and left the man on the floor with the drive still in his hand and Ethan's knee on his wrist. Ethan took the drive. He looked at it. Standard 3.5-inch, no markings, a strip of black tape over the manufacturer's label. The kind of nothing that contained everything. He stood up. His arm was complaining seriously now. He ignored it. "Who sent you?" he said. The man on the floor said nothing. His jaw was set in that particular way that meant he'd been trained not to talk, and the training had held. Ethan looked at him for a moment. "The people who hired you," he said quietly, "are going to let you take the fall for this. That's how these operations work, you know that, right?" Nothing. "Okay," Ethan said. He could hear the police in the building now. Radios, boots on the stairwell below, the organized sound of people who knew their job arriving to do it. He stepped back from the man, keeping the drive. The man's eyes tracked it. "You know what's on this?" Ethan said. It wasn't a question, still nothing, but the eyes answered it. Ethan left the server room and stood in the corridor for a moment, his back against the wall, left arm against his side, listening to the building reorganize itself around the arrival of people with authority. His ribs hurt when he breathed deeply, so he breathed shallowly. His eye had started bleeding again. He looked at the drive in his hand. "Defense adjacent," Victoria had said. He'd filed that away without examining it because there'd been no time to examine anything. But now, standing in the amber-lit corridor with the chaos settling around him, he turned the phrase over and felt something cold and specific attach itself to it. Not a general unease, something more targeted than that. He knew what defense adjacent meant in a certain context. He'd spent 11 years in that context. He pocketed the drive and went to find Victoria. She was on 36, where he'd told her to go, sitting on the floor of the landing with her back against the stairwell wall, and Brandon propped beside her, two uniformed officers standing over them both, with the carefully neutral expressions of people who had been told that the woman in stockings on the floor was the building's CEO and were processing that information. When Ethan came through the door, Victoria looked up, and something in her face did the thing that faces do when they've been holding tension for a long time and abruptly find it's no longer necessary. Not relief, exactly. More like a controlled release. "You're bleeding again," she said. "I'm fine." "You said that before." It was true then, too. He sat down on the step above her, which put him at eye level with the officers. "Ethan Cole, building maintenance. The two individuals in the server room corridor on 39 are down and secured. There's a third individual near the elevator bank on the same floor. The original three from 38 are down, two in the north corridor, one near the fire door. I don't have a current position on the remaining members of the group." The officers exchanged a look. One of them spoke into his radio. "Sir, we're going to need a full statement. I know. I'll give you everything." He glanced at Victoria. "She needs a doctor, and someone should check on Greg Ferris, her head of security. He was hit with some kind of incapacitating round near the executive conference room on 40. "He's okay," Victoria said. "I got word 10 minutes ago. He's conscious." Ethan nodded. He let himself lean back slightly against the stair railing, which helped his ribs. The adrenaline was finishing its exit now, and in its place was the familiar, unglamorous aftermath of a body that had been asked to do too much. Everything aching at once, in the dull and persistent way that didn't care about context. Brandon was watching him with the expression of a 24-year-old who was going to have a story to tell for the rest of his life. "Dude," Brandon said, "what are you?" Ethan looked at him. "Maintenance," he said. Brandon made a sound that was almost a laugh, and then stopped because it hurt his shoulder. Victoria said nothing. She was looking at Ethan's hands, the knuckles, the grease that was still there underneath everything else, the way he was holding his left arm slightly away from his body. She had spent the last 40 minutes in a state of sustained crisis, and she was very good at sustained crisis. But there was a different kind of processing happening now, a slower and less familiar kind that had to do. Not with what had happened, but with how it had happened and who had made it happen. The man beside her did not look like what he had done tonight. That was the thing she kept returning to. He looked like a man who needed an ice pack and 12 hours of sleep. He looked tired in the particular way of someone who is tired all the way down, not just on the surface. "You knew about the termination," she said. It wasn't the most important thing she had to say to him. She wasn't sure yet what the most important thing was. But it was the thing that came out first. Ethan glanced at her. "Got the letter this morning. And you still—" She stopped. "There were people in the building," he said simply. She let that sit. It didn't need anything added to it, and she'd learned enough about this man in the last hour to know that he wouldn't have wanted anything added to it. "The server room," she said instead, lowering her voice. The officers had stepped a few feet away to coordinate on the radio. "Did they get what they came for?" "No." He reached into his pocket and held up the drive without making it obvious to the room. She looked at it. "They got close. Whoever planned this knew exactly which partition they needed. It wasn't the demo data, wasn't the primary servers. It was the backup architecture, the developmental blueprint." Victoria's expression didn't change much, but her eyes went somewhere briefly and came back. "Almost nobody knew that partition existed," she said quietly. "I know." She looked at him. "How do you know what that means?" "Because I know what defense adjacent means," he said. Same quiet, same level. "When you're ready to have that conversation, I'll be here. But not tonight." She studied him for a long moment. This man she'd employed for 14 months without seeing, who had apparently spent all that time being someone she had not been equipped to recognize. "You have a military background," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Past tense," he said for the second time that night. One of the officers came back. "Mr. Cole, we need to get you both upstairs. Detectives want a full walkthrough, and we've got EMS on 40 for anyone needing evaluation." Ethan stood up, slower than he'd moved all night. He helped Brandon to his feet, and then he held out his hand to Victoria. She looked at it for a second. Then she took it and stood. She was not a person who accepted help easily. She had reasons for that too, the same way she had reasons for most things about herself. But she took his hand and she stood, and she did not immediately let go. "Thank you," she said, looking at him directly. Not the kind of thanks that goes in a card. Ethan met her eyes. Don't mention it, he said, and she could not entirely tell if he was being self-deprecating or literal, and somehow that was the most human thing he'd said all night. They went upstairs. The next 3 hours were the institutional kind of chaos, structured and repetitive and exhausting in a way that the preceding hour hadn't been, because adrenaline at least had the virtue of clarity. Ethan gave his statement twice, once to a detective named Ramirez, who was thorough and skeptical and warmed incrementally as the story held together across multiple tellings, and once to a federal agent who showed up at 10:30 without explanation and asked different questions in a different register. The federal questions were the ones Ethan had been expecting. He answered what he answered and declined what he declined, and did it all in the cooperative, specific, unbothered tone of a man who knew how these conversations worked. At one point, during a lull, he called Mrs. Kowalski. She picked up on the first ring. I already saw it on the news, she said before he could speak. Lily is fine. She's asleep. She doesn't know anything. He closed his eyes briefly. Thank you. Don't thank me, you stubborn man. Are you hurt? Some. Nothing serious. Ethan, I promise. A pause, then quieter. You come get her in the morning. She'll want to see you. I will, he said. First thing. He sat with that for a moment after he hung up. The image of Lily asleep in Mrs. Kowalski's spare room, the nature documentary they'd never watched, the oatmeal with raisins that she'd eaten under protest, the ordinary weight of it. He let himself feel it because he'd learned over years that if you didn't let yourself feel the ordinary things during the spaces between the rest of it, you started to lose track of why the rest of it mattered. His ribs were confirmed bruised, not broken, by the EMS team. The cut above his eye got 3 butterfly closures. His left arm was strained at the shoulder, not torn, just angry. He was given 2 ibuprofen and an ice pack and told to follow up with his own doctor, which he would remember to do in about 3 weeks, when the soreness became impossible to ignore. Around midnight, the formal activity on the floor wound down to the residual kind. Crime scene techs, a few remaining officers, the building's night security watching the perimeter. Ethan was sitting in the executive lounge with his ice pack and a cup of coffee that someone had produced from somewhere, staring at nothing in particular, when Victoria came and sat across from him. She'd found shoes. Someone had brought her a pair of flats from somewhere, and she'd pulled her hair back with a band, and she looked nothing like the woman who'd stood in front of a mirror at 6:15 checking her blazer collar, and she also looked, for the first time since Ethan had encountered her tonight, like a person rather than a function. She had 2 glasses of water. She set one in front of him. The federal agent, she said. Do you know what branch? I have a guess. The technology on that drive, she said. It has implications that go beyond my company. I've been developing it in partnership with a private defense contractor, and there are federal interests involved that I can't discuss in detail. She looked at him steadily. But you already know something about this, don't you? Ethan turned the water glass in his hands. What I know, he said carefully, is that the people who organized tonight's operation weren't random criminals. They were too coordinated, too specifically targeted. They knew your security protocols, your vendor access, your cell dead zones. He paused. And they knew about a server partition that you said almost nobody knew existed. Yes. Which means your leak isn't a disgruntled employee who talked too much. It's someone with access to classified level information about your operation. Someone who knew what to look for and where to find it. Victoria was quiet. How long have you been developing this technology? Ethan asked. 3 years. And the federal partnership? 18 months. She turned her water glass too, a mirroring gesture she probably wasn't aware of. I've had 2 previous security incidents, smaller, data probes, one attempted physical breach that my team intercepted before I was even notified. I thought we'd tightened everything after the second one. Someone let them in tonight, Ethan said. That freight elevator, the access code was entered correctly on the first try. It's a rotating code. Whoever gave them that had it as of today. She was looking at him with something that was almost wariness, except wariness implied distrust, and what he saw in her face wasn't distrust. It was something closer to the expression of a person who has been operating in a room they thought they understood and has just discovered a door they didn't know was there. Who are you? She asked. Not the way Brandon had asked it, with that 24-year-old awe. She asked it the way she would have asked a balance sheet question, directly, needing the actual number. Ethan set down the ice pack. He looked at her across the table and made a decision. Not the rapid calculation kind from earlier tonight, but a slower one, the kind that felt like turning a key. I spent 11 years as a Navy SEAL, he said. The last 4 of those were in a classified operational unit that I can't name and won't name. My last deployment ended 3 years ago. I left. He paused. I have a daughter. Her name is Lily. She's 8. Her mother left when Lily was 2, and I've been raising her alone since then. I took the maintenance job because it was stable hours, and I could be home most nights. He looked down at the table for a second, then back up. That's who I am. That's the whole list. Victoria held his gaze. Why did you leave? The SEAL unit. The question was blunter than he expected, which made it the right question. Because I did something on my last mission that I thought was necessary, he said, and I'm still not sure if I was right, and I decided I didn't want to keep making those decisions. He said it without drama, just a man reading a measurement out loud. I wanted to raise my daughter. I wanted to fix things that stayed fixed, faulty sensors and bad wiring instead of... He stopped. Instead of the other kind of problems. The room was quiet around them. Somewhere down the hall, a crime scene tech was talking into a phone. But the other kind found you anyway, Victoria said. Yeah, Ethan said. They tend to. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was doing what cities do at midnight, alive and indifferent and blazing, 40 stories below. She looked at it, and he looked at her looking at it, and neither of them spoke for a while. The technology on that drive, she said finally, is a predictive intelligence architecture. It can identify operational patterns in encrypted communications, not decrypt them, but recognize structural signatures that indicate the type of activity. The applications are significant, and there are people who would benefit enormously from making sure it never reaches the government partners I'm working with. Ethan was still. The group tonight, she continued, they weren't just thieves. They were sent by someone who has been trying to acquire or destroy this technology for at least 18 months. Someone with enough reach to plan an inside source in my organization and enough resources to run an operation like tonight's. She turned from the window and looked at him. I don't know who they're working for. My security firm has been trying to trace it. The federal contacts have been looking. Nobody has given me a name. Ethan said nothing. He was running something behind his eyes that she couldn't read. What? She said. There was a mission, he said slowly. My last deployment. We disrupted a private intelligence network, black market, selling operational architecture to actors who shouldn't have it. We burned the infrastructure, removed the leadership. He picked up the water glass, set it down without drinking. We thought we ended it. The assessment said we ended it. Victoria was very still. But assessments are only as good as the information they're based on, Ethan said. And if someone senior enough survived. He stopped. He looked at her. This is going to get complicated. It's already complicated, she said. More complicated than it is tonight, he said. I need you to understand that. She looked at him for a long moment. This tired, bleeding, ice pack-holding man in a gray maintenance uniform who had walked back into a building full of armed professionals because there were people who needed to get to a stairwell, who had saved a drive containing her life's most important work and pocketed it without making a speech about it, who had told her who he was with the same plainness with which he'd told her the sensor was reading inconsistent. I understand, she said. Outside, a siren climbed and faded. The city kept going. I'm going to rescind the termination, Victoria said. First thing tomorrow. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to. She said it with a flatness that was not unkind. That's not why I'm doing it. Ethan looked at her. What's the job? Figure that out with me, she said. Tonight proved that what I have isn't working, and you... She paused, in the way of a person who is precise with language and wants to be precise now. You see things differently than the people I've been relying on. You see this building. You understand what tonight was in a way that my security team doesn't, not fully. She held his gaze. I need someone who sees what's actually there, not what's supposed to be there. He was quiet for a moment. My daughter comes first, he said. Always. Non-negotiable. Understood. And I'm not a bodyguard. I'm not asking for a bodyguard. Then what are you asking for? She thought about it. actually thought about it, in the way she didn't always take time to do. Someone who knows how to find the door that isn't supposed to be there, she said, and knows what to do when it opens. The ice pack was melting. Somewhere in the building, 3 crime scene techs were documenting the evening's wreckage. In a spare bedroom across the city, Lily Cole was asleep and unknowing, safe in the temporary peace of a child who trusted that the person she needed would be there in the morning. Ethan Cole looked at the woman across the table from him, brilliant and difficult and controlled, and tonight, briefly and revealingly human. And he thought about the drive in his pocket, and the name he hadn't said aloud, and the mission that was supposed to have ended 3 years ago. "Okay," he said. Victoria Hale nodded once, the way she acknowledged things that were settled. Neither of them said anything after that for a while. The coffee went cold. The city went on outside the window. The floor smelled like dust and something chemical from the crime scene kits, and the lights were still on the emergency setting, amber and inadequate. And it was nothing like the sleek event this floor had been designed to host. It was just 2 people in a damaged building, at the beginning of something neither of them had planned. He picked up Lily at 7:15 in the morning, while the city was still in that particular early state where the light was thin and the streets hadn't committed yet to the full weight of the day. Mrs. Kowalski opened the door before he knocked. She'd been watching from the window, which was something she did and never acknowledged doing, and she looked at his face with the careful neutrality of a woman in her 60s who had seen enough of life to know when not to make it worse with commentary. "Breakfast is on the stove," she said. "Eat something before you take her." He ate standing at her kitchen counter, a bowl of oatmeal that had no raisins, while Lily slept for another 20 minutes. When she came out, she was still in her pajamas, hair going in 3 directions, and she walked directly into him and pressed her face against his chest without a word. He put his arm around her carefully, the left shoulder still stiff, still complaining, and held on. "You smell like a hospital," she said into his shirt. "I'm fine." "That's what you always say." "Because it's always true." She pulled back and looked up at him with the particular scrutiny of an 8-year-old who had been lied to before about minor injuries and had developed a detection system accordingly. She examined the butterfly closures above his eye. She noted the way he was standing with his left side slightly guarded. She said nothing about any of it, which was worse than if she'd said something. "Can we watch the nature documentary tonight?" she said. "Yes." "The whole thing?" "The whole thing." She studied him for another second. Then she went to get dressed. On the drive home, she talked about a girl in her class named Priya, who had brought a telescope to school for show and tell, which had apparently been both impressive and deeply unfair, given that Lily had brought a rock collection 2 weeks prior and gotten what she considered an inadequate response. Ethan listened and asked questions and made the right sounds, and by the time they got home she had moved on to planning what she wanted for her birthday in 4 months, and the ordinary world was doing what it always did, insisting on itself, filling the space, keeping him tethered to what mattered. He put her to bed that night at the regular time. He sat at the kitchen table after, with a glass of water and the drive on the table in front of him, and he thought about what Victoria had said and about what he hadn't said in return. He hadn't said the name. Not to her, not to the detective, not to the federal agent with the careful questions. He needed to be certain before he said the name, because once it was in the room, it didn't come back out. He put the drive in the kitchen drawer, under the takeout menus. Then he went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours before sleep arrived, and when it did, it wasn't restful. He started work. His new, indefinite, still being defined work, 9 days after the attack, in a temporary office on the 37th floor that had previously been used for storage and still smelled faintly of old paper and the accumulated indifference of a space no one had cared about. Victoria's assistant Dana had furnished it with a desk, a chair, a monitor, and a coffee maker that Ethan immediately moved to a better position. Dana watched him do this with the expression of someone recategorizing a person in real time. "Is there anything else you need?" she asked. "Building schematics," he said. "Every floor current as of this year. Access logs for the freight elevator going back 6 months. Vendor clearance records. Security camera coverage maps. Not the official ones, the actual ones showing real blind spots." Dana wrote it down without blinking. "That last one might take a day." "That's fine," Ethan said. "Also, the maintenance crew roster. Who had what access and when?" She paused at that one. "I know some of those people," she said carefully. "So do I," he said. That's not what I'm doing. I'm not building a suspects list based on who I liked or didn't like. I'm mapping access. It's different. She looked at him for a moment, then wrote it down. His title, per the paperwork Victoria's HR team had produced, was Director of Security Operations, which was a clean and corporate way of describing something that didn't have a clean and corporate shape yet. His actual function in those first days was closer to archaeology, going back through the layers of the building's recent history, looking for the place where something had been inserted that shouldn't be there. Victoria stopped by the office on his third day. She knocked, which he noticed, and came in carrying 2 coffees, which he also noticed. She set one on his desk without comment and looked at the wall where he'd taped up a coverage map of the building's security camera system. The real one, with the gaps marked in red. That's more red than I expected, she said. Camera coverage is usually designed for liability documentation, not security, he said. You film the entrances and the server rooms and the executive floors, and you call it done. But the service corridors, the mechanical spaces, the freight infrastructure, but most of that is unwatched. He pointed at a section of the map. The route they used on the night of the attack runs entirely through dead zones, every single turn. Victoria looked at it. That's not coincidence. No, someone walked that route specifically, tested it, probably more than once. He picked up the coffee. I've been going through the vendor access logs. In the 3 months before the attack, there were 11 separate service visits to the building from vendors who had freight elevator clearance. 7 of those were routine, and I can account for every person on each visit. 3 are pending. I'm waiting on credentialing records. He paused. The 11th visit was logged under a catering equipment maintenance company that I can't find any other record of in your vendor system. 1 visit, 4 weeks before the attack, 2 technicians, 2 hours in the building. Victoria set down her coffee. That wasn't flagged. It was approved by your facilities coordinator, a man named Dennis Holt. Silence. Dennis has been with this company for 6 years, Victoria said. Her voice was level. I know. He's not someone I would... She stopped herself. Ethan watched her do it, the conscious act of closing down a sentence that had started from instinct rather than evidence, something that required real discipline. He'd noticed she had that kind of discipline. What's the evidence? 3 things. The vendor entry was approved with his credentials and his alone. No secondary authorization, which your own protocol requires for any new vendor. His credentials were used to access the 39th floor server room at 11:47 p.m., 14 days before the attack, which is a time when he had no logged reason to be in the building. And his parking garage access shows he was in the building on the morning of the attack from 6:10 to 6:50 a.m., before the building officially opened, before any other staff. He paused. I don't know yet whether he was doing it willingly. Someone with the resources to run an operation like that attack could also be running leverage on an inside person. Blackmail, debt, family pressure. Does it matter? Victoria said. For how we handle it, yeah. For what happened, no. She stood there looking at the map for a moment. She had the quality, Ethan had noticed, of someone who processed bad news by going very still rather than reacting. Not numbness, more like the deliberate gathering of everything before she allowed it to move her. I hired Dennis, she said, 6 years ago. I personally reviewed his application. I know, Ethan said. That's not an explanation. She picked up her coffee. I wanted to say it out loud. He nodded. He understood that. Some things needed to be said out loud even when they didn't change anything. What do you want to do? He asked. I want to know if he's the only one, she said. Before we do anything, I want to know the full shape of it. That's the right call, he said. She looked at him then. The look she'd been giving him intermittently since the night of the attack. The one he couldn't entirely read but had started to recognize. Like she was still adjusting to some recalibration she hadn't finished making. You could have gone to the federal agent with this, she said. Ramirez. The other one. It's your company, Ethan said. It's your call first. She held his gaze for a second. Then she nodded, picked up her coffee, and left. Ethan turned back to the coverage map. The federal agent's name was Carla Wynn, and she came back on a Thursday afternoon without an appointment, which told Ethan something about how she operated. He was in the hallway outside his office when she stepped off the elevator, mid-40s, dressed in the specific way of federal agents who weren't trying to look like federal agents, a gray blazer and dark slacks, and the kind of low-key purposefulness that filled a room differently than authority that announced itself. She saw him and came directly toward him. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Agent Wynne," he said. She paused. "I didn't tell you my name." "Dana mentioned you were coming." She looked it up. He held the door to his office open. "Come in." She came in, looked at the wall map, looked at the desk with its organized stacks of access logs, looked at him. "You've been busy," she said. "I work here now." "I know." She sat down in the chair across from his desk, the one he'd put there for exactly this kind of conversation. "We've identified the group responsible for the attack. You may already know some of this." She watched his face. The operational cell was contracted through a private intelligence brokerage. No permanent staff, no fixed infrastructure. The kind of organization that exists on paper as a consulting firm and in practice as something else entirely. "A cutout," Ethan said. "Yes. We've dealt with this particular cutout before. 2 years ago in a completely different context. 3 years ago in one that might be relevant to you." She kept her eyes on him. 5 years ago, a SEAL operational unit disrupted a black market intelligence network operating out of... "I know the mission," Ethan said. She stopped. "I was there," he said. Something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, exactly. More like the confirmation of a hypothesis. "Then you know the name Marcus Vale." The name sat in the room between them, like a weight that had been waiting to be set down. "Vale was listed as killed in action during the disruption," Ethan said carefully. "That was the operational assessment." "The operational assessment was wrong," Wynne said. "We confirmed Vale's survival 14 months ago. He relocated, rebuilt slowly, re-established his network through cutouts and secondary brokers. He has been operating at reduced capacity for 3 years. She looked at Ethan steadily. "The attack on Hale Technologies fits his operational signature precisely. The level of inside access, the targeted specificity, the decision to use a contracted cell rather than his own people. That's Vale." Ethan said nothing for a moment. Outside his window, the city went about its business 40 floors below, indifferent and continuous. "He knows I'm here," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "Almost certainly," Wynne said. "The decision to target Hale Technologies is almost certainly not coincidental to your presence here. Vale has long-term operational memory. He tracks disruptions to his network. He would know the SEAL unit that burned him, and he would know the personnel involved." Ethan looked at the coverage map on his wall. He thought about the name on the termination letter and the 14 months of working in this building and the specific sequence of events that had led him from a maintenance worker who fixed sensors to the man sitting in this office having this conversation. "He was watching me," Ethan said. "We believe he identified your employment here several months ago. The attack may have been planned, at least in part, as a way to draw you back into an operational context." Wynn's voice was even, professional, stripped of anything that wasn't information, or as a warning, or both. "He wanted the drive," Ethan said. "He wanted the technology, yes. But a man like Vale doesn't separate objectives. He can want 3 things from the same operation." She looked at the desk. "Do you still have the drive?" "I gave it to the detective on the night of the attack," Ethan said. She held his gaze for a moment. He held it back. "Mr. Cole," she said. "I gave it to Detective Ramirez," Ethan said. "That's what's in my statement." Another moment. Then she moved on, which was either acceptance or filing away for later. And with people like Wynne, it was hard to know which. "We want to pursue Vale," she said. "The challenge is that his current infrastructure is built specifically to be untraceable at the organizational level. We can identify cells, contractors, cutouts. We cannot yet identify his physical location or the core of his operation." She paused. "What we need is for him to surface, to commit to an operation significant enough that he manages it directly rather than through contractors." Ethan looked at her. "You want to give him something worth coming out for?" "We want to give him a reason to move against Hale Technologies directly," she said. "Which means Hale Technologies needs to appear vulnerable in a very specific way, at a very specific time, in a way that Vale's sources inside the company—" "The source you don't know about yet," Ethan said. "Would relay to him," she finished. "Yes." He was quiet. "You're asking me to help build a trap," he said. "I'm asking you to consider it," she said. Your knowledge of the building, your operational background, your existing position here, you're the right person to help design it. And Vale already knows you're here, which means you're already a variable in whatever he plans next. She stood, which meant the conversation was at a point she'd chosen to end it. Talk to Ms. Hale. She needs to be part of any decision. This is her company. She pulled a card from her pocket and set it on his desk. Call me when you're ready. She left. Ethan listened to the elevator arrive and go. He sat for a long time looking at the coverage map. Then he picked up his phone and called Victoria. She came down in 12 minutes, which told him she'd cleared her calendar rather than finishing whatever she'd been in. She came in and closed the door and stood with her back to it for a moment, reading the room the way she always did before she spoke. When? She said. Yeah. I saw her in the lobby. Victoria came and sat across from him. Tell me. He told her. All of it. Vale, the mission, the assessment that had been wrong, what Wynne had asked for. He told it the way he told most things, without decoration, watching her face as the pieces assembled themselves into a shape neither of them had expected when the evening started 9 days ago. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. Marcus Vale, she said, trying the name. He goes by other names. He's been building under at least 3 separate identities since the original network was disrupted. The consulting firm that contracted the attack cell. That's 1 layer out from his core operation. Wynne thinks there are at least 2 more layers between that and him. But he's real, Victoria said. He's a specific person. Yes. And he knows who you are. Yes. She looked at the desk. Does he know about Lily? The question landed with more precision than Ethan expected, which said something about how clearly she'd been thinking about all of this since the night of the attack. I don't know yet, he said. That's the thing I need to know before anything else. How do you find that out? I talked to some people, he said. Former colleagues. People who have access to Vale's file and owe me enough to be honest about what's in it. He paused. It'll take a few days. And I need to keep Lily's routine as normal as possible while I do it, because if someone is watching me, which they probably are, any change in her pattern is a signal. Victoria absorbed this, so we act normal, as much as possible. She was looking at her hands now, a gesture he'd come to recognize as the one she made when she was working through something she didn't like the shape of. The trap Wynne is proposing, she said. It uses my company as bait. Yes. And it uses you as the visible element. Vale surfaces because he knows you're here, and because whatever vulnerability we manufacture looks like an opportunity. That's the rough shape of it. That's an enormous risk, she said. Yes, he said. It is. For you specifically. He looked at her. For a lot of people. She shook her head slightly. Not disagreement, more like she was pushing past something. I know that. I meant, if Vale is already watching you, and we run an operation that makes you the centerpiece, then you become the target. Not just the building, not just the technology. She met his eyes. You. I know. And Lily. The word in her mouth was careful and weighted, like she'd thought about whether to say it, and decided the answer was yes. That's why I need the days first, Ethan said. Before anything. Before I tell Wynne yes or no, I need to know what he already knows about her. Victoria nodded. She looked back at her hands. Dennis Holt, she said. Are you going to confront him? Not yet. Right now he's the clearest window we have into what Vale's people know. If we tip him off that we've identified him, that window closes. He paused. But I'm also not going to leave him in a position where he can cause any more damage. I've already quietly adjusted his system access, so that anything he sends or accesses gets logged to a secondary audit system he doesn't know exists. Victoria looked up. You can do that? Your IT security team helped. They didn't ask a lot of questions. Something crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. I need to meet your IT security team, apparently. They're good people, Ethan said. They've been working around inadequate infrastructure for years. Give them real resources, and they'll give you real security. Added to the list, she said. The conversation had the quality that their conversations had started to develop, a rhythm that moved between the operational and the personal without either of them making a production of the transition. He'd noticed it. He suspected she had too, and that neither of them had said anything about it because naming it would make it a thing that needed to be addressed. and there was already a sufficient quantity of things that needed to be addressed. My daughter's school does a family lunch thing on Fridays, Ethan said, slightly abruptly. Parents can come. I've been going every week since she started there. Victoria looked at him, uncertain where this was going. I'm going to keep going, he said. This week, next week, however long this takes. Whatever is happening here, that doesn't change. She held his gaze. I know, she said. And she said it like she meant it, not like it was reassurance. Okay, he said. He made the calls that evening after Lily was in bed. 3 calls, each one to a different person who knew a different part of what there was to know about Marcus Vale, and each conversation had the particular quality of exchanges between people who had once trusted each other in conditions where trust was the difference between living and not, and who now lived in the ordinary world and found that history didn't expire. The first call was to a man named Torres, who was now working private sector in Seattle, and who listened to Ethan's questions with the silence of someone taking them seriously before he said carefully that Vale's file had been flagged internally as a potential survivor case 18 months ago, and that there was ongoing collection activity he couldn't detail, but that the short answer to Ethan's core question was yes. They believed Vale had been actively gathering background on members of the original disruption unit. All of them? Ethan said. The ones who are findable, Torres said. You moved quiet, Ethan. Maintenance supervisor in a city of 3 million, common enough last name, no social media, no professional profile. You are probably harder to locate than most. But not impossible. Nothing's impossible with enough time. A pause. Does he know about the girl? Ethan's hand tightened on the phone. That's what I'm trying to find out, he said. I'll make some inquiries, Torres said. Carefully, give me 48 hours. The second call was shorter, and the third one was shorter still, each adding a layer to the shape of something he'd hoped he was wrong about and was increasingly certain he wasn't. He sat at the kitchen table after the last call and looked at the dark window over the sink and thought about the decision his last deployment had ended with, the one he still didn't know if he'd been right about, and thought about how the consequences of decisions rarely stayed inside the borders you'd drawn around them. He'd made a call in the field that had burned Vale's network. He'd believed it was necessary. He still believed it mostly. But necessary didn't mean consequence-free. It had never meant that. He'd known that going in, or he'd thought he had, and the difference between knowing something as a principle and knowing it as a weight you carry every day was the kind of difference that only becomes clear after. He got up and checked on Lily. She was asleep on her side, one arm thrown over the edge of the bed the way she always slept, her hair across her face. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went back to the kitchen and opened his laptop and started building the second phase of his investigation, because there was nothing else useful to do at midnight except work. And work at least moved the thing forward. 4 days later, Torres called back. Ethan was in his office at Hale Technologies, going through the secondary audit logs from Dennis Holt's system access, when the call came. He stepped out into the service corridor, which was empty and unmonitored, and picked up. I found something, Torres said, and his voice had the particular flatness of a man delivering news he didn't want to deliver. Vale's collection on the unit goes back about 2 years. Movement tracking, employment, family status. A pause. Your name is in there, Ethan, and there's a flag on your file. What kind of flag? The kind they put on information that's been operationally activated. Another pause. And there's a secondary file. It was compiled 8 months ago. The pause this time was longer. It has your daughter's name in it, her school, her schedule, photograph. The corridor was very quiet. How recent, Ethan said. His voice came out steady. He'd trained it to do that, and right now he hated how well the training worked because it meant he couldn't hear in his own voice what he was actually feeling. 8 months is the file creation date, Torres said. Last access was 11 days ago. 3 days after the attack. Okay, Ethan said. Ethan. I know, Ethan said. Thank you. He stood in the service corridor for a moment after he hung up. The fluorescent light above him flickered once and held. Somewhere in the building's structure, an HVAC unit cycled on, a sound he'd known for 14 months and knew the meaning of. He thought about the termination letter he'd initialed past without pausing. He thought about an 8-year-old girl who complained about raisins and oatmeal and had opinions about rock collections and slept with her arm over the side of the bed. He thought about Marcus Vale, who was real and specific and somewhere, and who had a photograph of his daughter. He called Victoria. She picked up on the second ring. What happened? I need to see you, he said. Now. A 2-second pause, the kind that meant she was reading the tone and reacting to what she read. I'll come down. Not your office, he said. The mechanical room on 38, no cameras. Another pause, shorter. 5 minutes, she said. He went to wait for her, and on the way he passed the storage closet where his old maintenance tools were still sitting in the corner where he'd left them, not yet reassigned, and he looked at them for a moment. The ordinary implements of an ordinary job, the life he'd been trying to build. And then he kept walking. Victoria arrived in 4 minutes. She came through the door and looked at his face and said nothing, because she was learning what his face looked like when things were bad, and she knew when words were the wrong first move. They have a file on Lily, he said. The mechanical room hummed around them. Victoria didn't move. Accessed 11 days ago, he said, after the attack. Someone confirmed she exists, confirmed her school and her schedule after the attack. That's not background collection. That's operational prep. Victoria's jaw tightened. He's going to use her. He's going to try, Ethan said, which means I have maybe days before he decides she's the most efficient way to control what I do. He looked at her steadily. I need to move her, tonight. Somewhere Vale's people can't find her and can't reach her. Somewhere that isn't connected to me or to this building or to anyone in my normal life. Victoria was quiet for exactly the length of time it took to think, rather than react. I have a property, she said. A house in the Berkshires. It's held through a corporate entity that isn't publicly connected to my name. I've used it twice in 5 years. It's not in any database that links back to Hale Technologies. Ethan looked at her. It's secure, she said. I had it swept and upgraded 2 years ago after a different kind of security concern. There's a couple who caretakes it. Retired, discreet, professional. Vera and Tom. They've signed NDAs, but more than that, they're good people. She held his gaze. Lily would be safe there, and the connection to you would be invisible. He stood looking at her for a long moment. The offer was exactly what he needed, and it came from exactly the person he'd have least expected to have it, and both of those facts sat strangely in the same moment. Why do you have a property? He asked. Because I'm a woman who runs a defense-adjacent technology company, she said. And 3 years ago, someone sent me a very specific kind of message that told me I should have somewhere to go that no one knew about. She said it without drama. Just a measurement, like his were. I understand the need. He nodded slowly. I'll need to explain it to Lily in a way that doesn't frighten her. What will you tell her? He thought about it. That she's going on an early vacation, that I'll be there as soon as I can. He paused. She'll know something is wrong. She always does. But she'll also go if I ask her to because she trusts me, and that's the thing I have to not let myself think about too long right now. Victoria said nothing, but she looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not the CEO's controlled assessment, not the embattled executive from the night of the attack. Something that was simply and directly human, the look of a person responding to another person's pain without trying to fix it or manage it or turn it into a solvable problem. I'll call Vera tonight, she said. She'll have everything ready. Thank you, he said. It was the second time he'd said that to her, and both times he'd meant it in the same way she'd meant hers on the stairwell. Not a social courtesy. A real one. He left the mechanical room and went back to his office and sat for a while with his hands on the desk. Not working, just being still for a few minutes before the stillness became a luxury he couldn't afford. He thought about Lily's face at Mrs. Kowalski's door in the morning, the way she'd walked directly into him and pressed her face against his chest without a word. He thought about what it cost a child to trust a parent completely, the unexamined faith of it, the weight of being the person that trust was invested in. Then he picked up his phone, called Mrs. Kowalski to check on the afternoon pickup schedule, spoke to Lily for 5 minutes about the telescope girl and the ongoing injustice of comparative show-and-tell responses, told her he loved her, and after he hung up, he let himself feel all of it for exactly 60 seconds. Then he called Wynne. I'm in, he said, when she picked up. A pause. What changed? He has a file on my daughter, Ethan said, which means the only way to make her safe is to end this, so I'm in. Wynne's voice was careful. I understand. I need 48 hours to move her somewhere secure, he said. After that, we plan. 48 hours, Wynne said. And Cole, I know what this costs. No, Ethan said quietly. You really don't. He hung up. He looked at the coverage map on his wall, all those red marks where the cameras didn't reach, all those gaps in the building's vision that someone had learned to move through. He was going to have to stop being the man who fixed things and become, one more time, the man who ended them. He hated that. He did it anyway. He drove Lily to the Berkshires on a Sunday morning, leaving the city before 6, while the streets were still empty enough that he could watch his mirrors properly. He'd packed her bag himself the night before, enough for 2 weeks, her favorite sweatshirt, the small field guide to North American birds she'd been working through since summer, her tablet loaded with downloaded shows for when the boredom hit, which it would. He'd done it methodically, folding things the way she liked them folded, which was with the sleeves in rather than out, because she'd told him once that inside-out sleeves were chaotic, and she'd meant it completely. She sat in the passenger seat with her feet on the dash, which he normally didn't allow, and he didn't say anything about it this morning. She knew something was happening. She'd known from the moment he'd told her about the trip. His voice had been right, his face had been right, but something in the overall texture of the moment had been wrong, and Lily had 8 years of reading him and was better at it than most adults he knew. She'd asked 2 questions and accepted the answers with the particular restraint of a child who understands that pressing isn't always the right move. They drove for 3 hours through country that got progressively more itself. Hills coming up through the autumn color, the kind of landscape that felt older than the roads running through it. Lily slept for the last hour with her cheek against the window, and her breath fogging the glass in small, regular intervals, and Ethan drove and watched the mirrors and let the silence be what it was. Vera met them at the gate of the property, a compact, gray-haired woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone who'd spent a career in a field that required paying attention and had never entirely stopped. She shook Lily's hand like she was a person rather than a child to be handled, which immediately raised Vera's standing, in Lily's estimation, to a visible degree. I have a bird feeder out back, Vera said. Tom put it up last spring. We've had 3 species of woodpecker so far this year, if you're interested. Lily looked at her. 3 species? Downy, hairy, and a pileated. The pileated is large. You'll hear it before you see it. Lily turned to her father. Can I see? Go ahead, he said. She went with Vera without looking back, which was what he'd been hoping for, and also cost him something he wasn't going to examine right now. Tom appeared from the direction of the house. Broad-shouldered, 60s, the kind of calm that came from being a person who'd long since stopped needing to prove anything, and nodded to Ethan. She'll be safe, Tom said. Just that. No elaboration. I know, Ethan said. He went to find Lily before he left. She was at the back of the property, looking up into a stand of old maples with the bird guide open in her hands, and she'd already found the pileated. He could hear it somewhere above them, hammering at something with a focus that seemed disproportionate to a woodpecker, though Lily had once explained to him at length why it was actually entirely proportionate, and he'd been convinced. It's really loud, she said, without looking away from the trees. Yeah. Is it loud enough to be annoying if you're trying to sleep? Woodpeckers stop at dark, he said. Oh. She tracked something through the branches. How long will you be? I don't know exactly. He crouched down beside her so they were at the same level, looking up at the same trees. But I'll call every night, and when this is done I'll come get you, and we'll stay for a few extra days if you want. Tom said there's a lake. Does it have fish? I assume. Do we have fishing stuff? We can get fishing stuff. She was quiet for a moment. The woodpecker hammered. A leaf fell somewhere to their left. Is it dangerous? She said. What you're doing? He thought about lying. He considered it seriously, the way you consider an option before you rule it out. Then he said, There's some risk. I'm going to be very careful. She nodded slowly. She still wasn't looking at him, which meant she was processing rather than shutting down. You always come back, she said. Not a question, a statement she was making out loud to test its weight. I always come back, he said. She lowered the bird guide and looked at him then, and her face had the expression he'd seen on it a handful of times in 8 years, older than it should be, the particular seriousness of a child who'd had to grow certain parts of herself in the absence of the usual supports. Okay, she said. He held her for a moment carefully with the left shoulder, not mentioning the left shoulder. Then he stood up. Call me when you find all 3 woodpecker species. I already found one, she said, going back to the trees. He walked to his car and drove back to the city and did not allow himself to think about it because there was too much to do, and thinking about it wouldn't change anything and would make him slower, and he could not afford to be slower. The plan took shape over 4 days in Wynn's field office, a nondescript suite on the 14th floor of a building 6 blocks from Hale Technologies that could have been an insurance firm or a mid-level consulting practice, and was in fact neither. There were 4 of them in the room for most of it. Wynn, Ethan, a federal analyst named Park, who was 30 years old and handled data the way some people handled language, fluidly and without apparent effort, and Victoria, who had been included without debate because it was her company and her technology, and she'd been the most direct about not accepting any version of this plan that didn't keep her informed. The bait was straightforward in concept and complicated in execution, the way most things were. The cover story, fed through channels that Wynn's team had reason to believe reached Vale's network, was that Victoria was planning a second demonstration of the predictive intelligence architecture, this one private, invitation only, with the core developmental data accessible on a local network for a compressed window during the presentation. The kind of opportunity that, to someone who'd already tried once and failed, would look like a second chance at the same target with reduced security. The trap inside that was Ethan's design. Not what would happen during the event. That was standard federal operation planning, Wynn's domain, but the building itself, which he knew in a way that no plan on paper could fully represent. He spent 2 of those 4 days walking the floors with Park, identifying every weakness in the coverage map that could be presented as an access route while being secretly closed, every service corridor that could be sealed from the inside without being visible from the outside, every junction in the building's camera system where a feed could be split to show Vale's people what Ethan wanted them to see. You're designing a funnel, Park said, on the second afternoon, looking at the schematic Ethan had marked up. I'm designing a building that looks the same from the outside and is completely different inside, Ethan said. There's only one way through it that works. They'll think they're choosing their route. They're not. Park looked at the schematic for a moment. That freight elevator access, the one they used the first time. Still visible, still accessible, still appears to lead to the same dead zone in camera coverage. Ethan pointed. Except on the night of the event, that dead zone is going to have 6 federal agents in it. Park made a note. And Holt? Dennis Holt had been the most delicate piece. They needed him to carry the information, the cover story, the false vulnerability window, the event details, to Vale's network. But they needed it to happen in a way that looked natural rather than fed, because Vale, as Wynn had noted, was not a man who survived by accepting things that looked too convenient. Ethan had solved this the way he solved most problems, by thinking about it from the other direction. Holt didn't need to be given information to pass on. He needed to find it, which meant the information needed to be placed where Holt would naturally encounter it in the course of his normal work. And it needed to be the kind of information that felt like something he'd uncovered rather than something he'd been handed. He reviews the facility's calendar as part of his job, Ethan had told Wynn. Every week, he has read access to certain planning documents that come through the facility's coordination system. If we put the event details in a planning document at the right permission level, one he'd access anyway, and we make the security details look like they were accidentally included in a file he shouldn't have seen, he'll believe he found it, and he'll pass it. Wynn had looked at him for a long moment. That's a clean piece of work, she said. It's maintenance thinking, Ethan said. You understand the system. You put the thing where the system will carry it. On the 3rd day, Victoria pulled Ethan into a side conversation while Park was running coverage calculations. They stood at the window of the field office, which looked onto the street below at an angle that showed the corner of Hale Technologies building 6 blocks away. You've designed a trap that keeps me at the center of it, she said. You're the target. That's not design. That's the situation. I know. She crossed her arms, not defensive, more like she was holding something in while she said the rest of it. I want to understand what happens if it doesn't work the way you've planned. If Vale sends another contracted cell and manages it remotely, the way he did the first time. Then we have another attack and we still don't have him. That's possible, Ethan said. And if it works, if he comes closer to manage it himself, or sends people senior enough to lead us back to him, then the building becomes a real conflict zone. Not a contained action like the first time. A federal operation. Yes, with my staff potentially in the building. We're recommending a reduced presence event. 50 people maximum, vetted, briefed that there's elevated security without being told specifics. The federal team will be embedded as event staff. He paused. It'll still have risk. I know. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not looking for reassurance. I just want to make sure we're both looking at the same thing. We are, he said. She nodded. Outside, the street went about its business. How are you doing? She said. The question was simple and direct and without preamble, and it was the first time she'd asked it in that way. Not about the plan, not about the operational status, but about him. He considered deflecting. It was his first instinct. I don't love having her that far away, he said instead. I know she's safe. I know Vera and Tom are good. I still don't love it. That's reasonable, Victoria said. It's a distraction. It's also human, she said. Those aren't the same thing. He looked at her. She was looking at the street, and she had the quality in that moment of someone who was being careful with what they said, without being careful in a way that was dishonest. He'd noticed she did that, curated rather than concealed, which was different. What about you? He said. She didn't answer immediately. I've been running this company since I was 26, she said. I've managed crises before, not like this one, but professional crises, financial ones. A lawsuit 4 years ago that I genuinely wasn't sure I'd survive professionally. She turned from the window. This one is different because the people who are trying to destroy what I've built don't care about the business argument. They're not competitors. They're not regulators. They want the technology because of what it can do in the wrong hands, and they'll hurt anyone between them and it. She met his eyes. That's harder to manage, because you can't out-argue it. You can't out-strategize it in a boardroom. No, Ethan said. You were right that night, she said, when you said the only way through it is to end it. He nodded once. So let's end it, she said. Dennis Holt accessed the falsified planning document on a Wednesday, 11:17 in the morning. Park's audit system caught it in real time and sent an alert to Ethan's phone. And Ethan was in his office when it came in, and he sat looking at the notification for a moment before forwarding it to Wynn with a single line. Clock starts now. Wynn's response came back in 4 minutes. Confirmed. Event in 5 days. Activating. 5 days was a compression, tighter than ideal, but Wynn's intelligence suggested Vale's operational tempo had increased since the first attack, which meant the window for him to plan a second approach before changing his own position was narrowing. They couldn't afford to wait for the most comfortable timeline. Ethan spent those 5 days in the building. He slept 4 hours a night in his office on a cot that Dana had produced from somewhere without comment, and he ate whatever was available, and he walked the floors every evening with the methodical attention of a man who wanted to know the building the way he knew it before. Not as infrastructure, but as a living environment, with its rhythms and its habits, and the particular way it changed from day shift to night shift to the deep quiet after midnight, when only the essential systems were running. He talked to Lily every evening. She had found all 3 woodpecker species by the second day, which had led to a conversation with Vera about migration patterns that had apparently run well past dinner, and Tom had taken her fishing on the lake, and she'd caught 2 small bass that she'd released because she'd decided after the second one that she preferred them in the water. She told him about this in the precise and serious way she told him things that mattered to her, and he listened with his eyes closed and her voice filling the temporary space he'd made of his office. Tom says the pileated is probably nesting in the east stand, she said one evening. That would explain why it's always over there. Makes sense, Ethan said. He says they mate for life. Yeah, they do. A pause. That's a long time to be with someone. For a woodpecker, yeah. I mean, in general, she said. He opened his eyes. Yeah, he said. It is. She moved on to something else, and he let it pass, but he sat with it for a while after they hung up. The small, sideways way that children touch things they're actually thinking about, the way Lily had always done it, and the particular frequency it hit him at that evening, in that room, in the middle of what was coming. On the 4th night, Victoria came to the building at 9 p.m. She'd been in and out throughout the preparation days, working alongside Wynn's team with an efficiency that Ethan had watched the federal agents recalibrate to. They'd expected a CEO who needed to be managed, and they'd gotten someone who asked precise questions and retained the answers and never needed to be told anything twice. She came to his office with 2 sandwiches from the place on the corner that stayed open until midnight, and she set one on his desk without asking and sat across from him and ate the other one, and for a while they didn't talk about the operation at all. "Were you always like this?" she said eventually. He looked up. "Like what?" "This." She gestured at the desk, the coverage map, the organized stacks of material. "Methodical, quiet, like you're always 6 steps ahead and you're just waiting for the room to catch up." "No," he said. "I was a pretty chaotic kid, actually." She looked like she didn't quite believe that. "My grandmother used to say I had the energy of 3 children and the focus of none," he said. "That changed with training. The focus came later." He paused. "The quiet came from Lily." "From Lily?" "When she was born, I realized that my internal noise level had to come down," he said. "Infants read you. She'd get upset if I was wound up, and I had to learn to actually be calm rather than just look it." He turned his sandwich in his hands. "It changed how I did everything. I didn't expect that." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I don't have that," she said. "Anyone who reads me. Most people respond to whatever surface I'm presenting." "Most people," Ethan said. She looked at him. He looked back at her steadily and without particular expression, and she held the look for a moment and then went back to her sandwich, which was not quite deflection and not quite acknowledgement, and was, he thought, probably as much as she was ready to do with that. "Tomorrow night," she said. "Tomorrow night," he confirmed. She finished her sandwich. She looked at the coverage map on the wall, those red marks they'd been working around and through for 3 weeks now. "After this," she said, "I want to rebuild the whole security infrastructure from the ground up. Real coverage, real protocol, real culture around it rather than compliance theater." She paused. "I'd like you to lead that." "That's a significant build," he said. "I know. That's why I want someone who actually understands what they're building." He nodded slowly. "Let's get through tomorrow first." "Yes," she said. "Let's." She left, and he went back to the coverage schematic, and the building hummed around him in its nighttime register, and he thought about the trap they'd built inside it, the funnel, the false routes, the agents in the freight elevator dead zone. And he thought about Marcus Vale, somewhere in the world, looking at information that Holt had passed, and deciding that the opportunity was real. Come on, Ethan thought, at no one in the room. The event began at 7 p.m. 51 guests, vetted, briefed in general terms, accompanied by 12 embedded federal agents in event staff uniforms that were better than the ones the contracted cell had worn the first time. Victoria presented with the polished control of someone who had done this many times, moving through the demonstration material with fluency and measured energy, and the room watched her the way rooms always watched her. Attention that verged on wariness, the response to someone who occupied their own space completely. Ethan was not in the event room. He was in the service corridor on 38, with a radio on a dedicated channel and Park's voice coming through an earpiece in real time. He wore no uniform tonight, dark clothes, practical, the kind that didn't announce anything. He moved through the corridors the same way he'd moved through them for 14 months, but differently too, because tonight the building was not a place to maintain. It was a place to use. At 8:14, Park's voice in his ear, "Freight elevator activated, basement level, 3 individuals." "Copy," Ethan said. At 8:19, "They're on 37, moving toward the service corridor." "They're following the route," Ethan said. "Affirmative. Wynn's team is in position." He waited. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere above him, the event was continuing. He could feel the building doing what buildings do when they hold a crowd, a particular distributed weight in the floors and walls, different from the emptiness of a night building. At 8:23, the tone in Park's voice changed. "Ethan, we have a problem." He was already moving. "What?" "The 3 in the freight route. They're a diversion. We're picking up a second entry point. North mechanical access on 39. Someone came through the roof access." The roof access. It wasn't on the coverage map because it was considered sealed, a structural access point used once a year for HVAC inspection, coded, alarmed, except that someone had known to disable the alarm, and the only people who would know the code sequence for that particular access point were building maintenance staff. His former staff. "How many?" Ethan said. 2. One of them is carrying something. Park hesitated. Ethan, the signal profile on what he's carrying looks like a remote detonator package. The tunnel vision that descended was not panic. It was the opposite of panic. A specific narrowing of the world to its essential elements, the way his training had built it, the way Lily had deepened it. 2 people. Roof access on 39. Detonator package. The server room was on 39. They weren't here for the data this time. They were here to destroy it. Win, he said into the radio. Her voice came back clipped and controlled, already handling the freight elevator situation. I hear Park. Go. I'm going to 39. Cole, we'll wait for backup. He was already in the stairwell. He took the stairs the way he took everything when it mattered. Not fast in a way that burned him out before he arrived, but efficient, no wasted motion, each landing a calculation about what came next. The door to 39 was at the top of a final half flight, and he paused below it to listen. The corridor above was quiet. He opened the door. The server room was 40 feet to his left, past the same corridor he'd moved through on the night of the first attack. One of the 2 individuals from the roof was visible at the far end, keeping watch at the corridor junction. The other was presumably inside the server room. The guard at the junction was professional. Standing position, low profile against the wall, sight lines covering both approaches. A man who had done this before and knew what he was doing. Ethan had 3 seconds to make a decision because the guard's head was completing a scan and was going to reach Ethan's position in 3, 2. He went right instead of straight, through a side door into the electrical room that he'd been fixing a junction box in on the morning of the termination letter. He moved through it in the dark because he knew the dark in this room. He'd worked in it enough times that the layout was in his feet rather than his eyes. And he came out the other side through the maintenance hatch that connected to the server room's secondary access. A panel in the back wall that existed for cable routing and was the size of a large cabinet and was, on any normal night, entirely invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. He knew it was there. He came through it quietly, which was not the same as silently, but quietly enough that the man inside the server room had only just registered the sound when Ethan was already across the space. The man was big, bigger than the ones from the first attack, and he had the detonator package in his hands. A compact device, professional grade, the kind that was designed for precise structural damage rather than broad destruction. He swung toward Ethan and threw the package to his left hand by instinct, reaching for his weapon with his right. Ethan went for the package hand. What followed was not the controlled precision of the first attack. His ribs still carried the ghost of that night's bruising, and the left shoulder wasn't fully right, and the man was good enough that the fight moved through the server room in a way that took out one rack and put Ethan's back into a second, and he felt the impact all through the left side and registered it and kept going because stopping was the option that didn't work. The package hit the floor during the second exchange. Ethan kicked it toward the cable routing hatch and kept his attention on the man, who was recalibrating after the loss of it. A half-second of adjustment, the brief internal reorganization of a professional who's lost a primary objective and is deciding what the secondary one is. Ethan didn't give him the half-second. It ended on the floor near the door. The man face down, Ethan's knee between his shoulder blades, breathing hard through his nose with the left side screaming and the room around them lit in the blue-white glow of 100 server status lights. Through the door, he could hear movement in the corridor, fast, organized, Wynn's people arriving. Clear, Ethan said into the radio. Server room 39 is clear. Package is secured. He paused, breathing. Get someone to the corridor junction. There's a second individual. Already have him, Wynn's voice came back. Freight team is contained. 3 individuals in custody. A pause. Cole, you're alive? Yes, he said. Good, she said, which was as close to warmth as Wynn got, and he'd take it. He sat back from the man on the floor, who had stopped struggling and was now in the resigned stillness of someone who knows the math has finished. Ethan's hands were shaking slightly. The adrenaline completing its chemistry, doing what it always did on the other side, and he let the shaking happen because fighting it was pointless, and he was past the point of needing to perform steadiness for anyone. 2 federal agents came through the door. He stood up, which took more effort than he showed, and stepped back to let them work. He picked up the detonator package from the cable hatch. He looked at it. It was sophisticated. Not something you bought anywhere. Not something a contracted cell assembled from parts. This was manufactured hardware, the kind of thing that came from an organization with real infrastructure behind it. Vale hadn't sent contractors this time. He'd sent his own people, which meant Park had been right about the operational tempo increasing. And it meant something else too. Something that Wynn had said in their first real conversation about what it meant when Vale moved closer to an operation himself rather than managing it from a distance. He came out of the server room into the corridor, where agents were moving through the floor in the organized way of a contained operation that had gone more or less according to plan, and he leaned against the wall for a moment and closed his eyes briefly and thought about the detonator package, and about the roof access, and about the specific knowledge required to disable that alarm. Someone had given Vale's people the alarm code. Not Holt. Holt's access didn't include the roof systems. Someone else. He opened his eyes. He called Park. "The roof alarm," he said when Park picked up. "Pull the access log. Who disabled it and when?" Keyboard sounds. A pause. "Disabled at 6:42 p.m. tonight, using a credential belonging to..." Park stopped. "Park. It's your credential, Ethan. Your old maintenance credential, the one from before you changed roles." Ethan stood very still. His old maintenance credential, which had been in the system for 14 months, and which should have been deactivated when his role changed, but hadn't been, because the credentialing transition had happened in a hurry, and the IT team had flagged it as a pending action, and it had sat in a queue. He'd seen it in the audit logs. He'd meant to close it out. He hadn't gotten to it. "Someone used my old credential," he said. Yes, at 6:42. He thought about that number, 6:42. He'd been in the building at 6:42. He'd been on 37 at 6:42. He could prove it from Park's own monitoring. "Someone who had access to my credential used it," he said. "Either they pulled it from a system they shouldn't have access to, or someone inside your former maintenance team gave it to them," Park said. He stood in the corridor with the blue light of the server room behind him, and the sounds of the federal operation moving through the building around him, and he thought about his maintenance crew. 7 people, none of whom he'd suspected, all of whom he'd worked alongside for over a year, all of whom were now technically employed by the outsourcing vendor that had taken over the contract after his reassignment. "Get me the roster," he said. "Everyone who had system access in the transition period. All of them." "Sending it now." He looked at his phone. The roster loaded. He went down the list. 7 names, 6 of them he knew well enough to read from memory. Their patterns, their habits, who they called on their breaks, how they handled the work. The 7th was a name he knew less well. A newer hire who'd come on 3 months before Ethan's reassignment. A young man named Kyle Merritt, who was quiet and competent, and who Ethan had liked without having any particular reason to know him deeply. He looked at the name. He called Torres. "I need you to run a name for me," he said. "Kyle Merritt, current employee of..." He gave the vendor company's name. "He's in the maintenance department. I need to know if he appears in any of Vale's connection mapping." Torres called back in 11 minutes. "He's not in the core mapping," he said, "but there's a secondary connection. His father worked for one of Vale's cutout companies 8 years ago. Administrative role, probably didn't know the full picture. Company folded, father lost his retirement savings." A pause. "Son would have reason to hold a grievance, and Vale's people are good at finding grievances." Ethan closed his eyes for a second. He wasn't angry. He was something more complicated than angry. The feeling of understanding something completely and finding that understanding didn't make it any cleaner. "Thank you," he said. He went to find Wynn. She was in the event space, which had been cleared of guests 40 minutes earlier when the building lockdown protocol had been activated, and which now had the strangely deflated quality of a room that had been full and wasn't anymore. The demonstration equipment was still set up. The chairs were in their event rows. 2 federal agents were at the far end, and Wynn was near the window, on her phone. She saw him and ended the call. "You look like hell," she said. "Left side," he said. "I'll live." He told her about the roof alarm, about his old credential, about Kyle Merritt and Torres's call. She listened without interrupting, which was what he'd come to know as her listening mode, and when he finished, she was quiet for about 4 seconds. "We can't prove Merritt used your credential," she said. "Not yet. But the logs plus the connection mapping plus the timing is enough to bring him in for questioning." She paused. "That's not Vale." "No," Ethan said. "That's not Vale." Tonight gives us 7 individuals in custody. 2 of them are close enough to the core operation that they'll talk, given the right pressure and the right offers. The detonator package is traceable hardware. We've already got a manufacturing signature on it. She looked at him. This is progress, real progress, but he's still out there. I know, Ethan said. The intelligence from tonight's operation, combined with what we pull from these 7 and the hardware trace, gives us probably 72 hours before we have a location or a name that leads to a location. She held his gaze. I need you in the room for that analysis. You know his operational thinking in a way my analysts don't. I'll be there, he said. Victoria came through the far door then, moving with the purpose of someone who had been waiting to be allowed back into a room and was done waiting. She was still in her event clothes, and she looked at the space between them, Ethan against the wall with his hand pressed to his left side, Wynne in the center of the room with the controlled energy of someone running something. And she read it all without asking. Contained, she said. Contained, Wynne confirmed. 7 in custody. Building is secure. Victoria looked at Ethan. Her eyes moved to his left side and back up. I'm fine, he said. You always say that, she said, which was Lily's line, and hearing it from her mouth did something unexpected and brief to his chest. Because it's always true, he said, which was his line, and something in her expression shifted very slightly at the echo. She crossed the room and stood near him. Not crowding, just proximate, the way that people stand near each other when the crisis is over, and they're both still running on the last of the adrenaline, and neither of them knows quite what to do with the transition out of it. The technology is intact, she said. Yes. The building is still standing. Yes. And your ribs? Bruised, he said. Again. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, which was the most genuinely unguarded thing he'd heard from her, and it lasted about 1 second before she pulled it back. Come on, she said. Wynne needs us to be useful, and I need coffee, and you need to sit down before you fall down. He didn't argue. He followed her, and behind them the building settled into the particular quiet that follows a storm. Everything still in place, a little roughed up, functional, holding. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city burned on below, 40 stories of indifference and continuity, and somewhere beyond it, in the direction of the Berkshires, Lily Cole was asleep in a borrowed room with a bird guide on the nightstand and no knowledge of any of this, and that was exactly as it should be. Ethan pressed his hand to his left side and went to work. The 72 hours Wynne had estimated turned into 51. The manufacturing signature on the detonator package traced back to a procurement channel that Park's team unwound in layers over 2 days. Cut out to shell company to registered vendor to a logistics network operating out of 3 cities simultaneously. At each layer there was someone who knew the next name, and at each layer Wynne's team applied the specific pressures available to federal agencies when they had 7 people in custody, hardware evidence, and the patience to work methodically rather than fast. Ethan sat in the field office for most of those 51 hours. He slept in intervals, ate when Park put food in front of him, and contributed what he could to the analysis, which was less about data than about pattern recognition, about the way Vale's operational decisions fit a profile that Ethan had started building in his memory 11 years ago and never entirely stopped. The federal analysts were good. They were thorough, current, technically skilled. What they didn't have was the accumulated texture of someone who had once sat in a briefing room and been told everything known about Marcus Vale and had spent years filing that knowledge away without knowing he'd ever need it again. It was the 5th contractor they interviewed who gave them the city. Not directly. He didn't have a direct address, didn't have a name. But he described a logistics handoff that had happened 4 weeks prior, and the description of the location, cross-referenced against 3 other pieces of geographic data Park pulled from the operation's communication metadata, narrowed the radius to a 4-mile area in a mid-sized city 400 miles away. That was enough for Wynne's people. They had assets that could work a 4-mile radius. Ethan was not part of what came next. That was the part that belonged to people who still carried badges and operated under active warrants, and he understood that without needing to be told, understood it the way he understood the edges of most things. Not with resentment, just with the accuracy that comes from knowing where you actually stand. He was in the field office at 2 a.m. on the 3rd day when Wynne called him. "We have him," she said. He sat with that for a moment. 2 words, and the weight of everything that had been pressing against the last 3 weeks shifted all at once, not disappearing but rearranging itself into something he could set down. Alive? He said. Yes, in custody. His legal team will have him for years and it'll be expensive and ugly, but the federal case is solid. The hardware trace, the contractor testimonies, the communication records we pulled from his network. He's not walking away from this. A pause. It's done, Cole. He put the phone down on the table and sat in the quiet field office with Park asleep on a cot in the corner and the city doing its 3 a.m. thing outside the window. The particular version of alive that cities manage in their deep hours, thin and persistent. And he let it be over. He thought about his last mission. The decision he'd made in the field that had burned Vale's network the first time. The call that had ended his career because he'd understood afterward that he couldn't keep making calls like that one without losing something he wasn't willing to lose. He thought about whether the decision had been right, which was the question he'd carried for 3 years without resolution. And he found that tonight it sat differently than it usually did. Not answered, not resolved, but quieter. The consequence of the decision had been Vale's survival. The consequence of that had been everything in the last 3 weeks. And the consequence of the last 3 weeks was that Vale was in custody and the technology was intact, and 7 people who would have used that detonator were going to spend significant portions of their lives being held responsible for that. He couldn't call it clean. It wasn't clean. But it wasn't the endless open question. It had been either, and there was a difference between those two things that he hadn't been sure he'd ever find. He called the Berkshires. Vera picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant she'd been waiting. It's over, he said. A pause. I'll tell her in the morning, Vera said. She's asleep. Don't wake her, he said. Just tell her in the morning that I'm coming. She already knows you're coming, Vera said. She told Tom this afternoon, told him you'd probably call tonight. He closed his eyes briefly. Of course she did. She's an unusual child, Mr. Cole. Yeah, he said. She is. He drove up on a Friday, arriving before noon with the windows down because the air in the Berkshires in October had a quality that city air didn't. Colder, thinner, carrying the smell of old leaves and moving water, and something that wasn't quite silence but was as close as the inhabited world got to it. Lily was waiting at the end of the property's gravel drive when he pulled in, which meant she'd been watching for his car and had timed the walk to intercept him at exactly the right point, a calculation that was entirely characteristic. She was wearing her favorite sweatshirt and carrying the bird guide, and had a stick she'd found somewhere that she'd been using as a walking staff, judging by the worn grip of it. He stopped the car and got out. She looked at him with the assessment that she'd had since she was small. That particular inventory she ran whenever he came back from something, checking the count of him against what she'd sent out. You hurt your side, she said. Bruised ribs. It's mostly healed. Your eye, too. The butterfly closures were gone 3 weeks later, but there was a faint line remaining that would fade. What happened? Someone ran into a wall faster than they expected, he said, which was not precisely a lie. She considered this. Is it finished? Yes, he said. It's finished. She nodded, once, with the gravity of someone receiving a formal report. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around him, careful of his left side in a way that meant Vera had mentioned it, and he held her in the October air with the trees doing their October thing, and the woodpecker making its unreasonable noise somewhere above them, and none of it required any description or amplification because it was simply what it was. Tom says the base are biting in the mornings, she said into his shoulder. Then we'll go in the morning, he said. She pulled back. Do we have fishing stuff? I stopped on the way up. She looked at him with an expression that was close to approval. Did you get a net? Yes? A good net or a cheap net? A reasonable net, he said. She seemed to decide that was acceptable and turned back toward the house, and he followed her through the cool air and the long grass. And behind them his car sat at the end of the gravel drive with the windows still down, and nothing in the world required him anywhere else for the next 4 days. They stayed the full 4 days. Tom took them out on the lake both mornings, and Lily caught 4 bass and released all of them on a principled basis that she explained in detail each time. And Ethan sat in the stern of the rowboat with his coffee going cold in his hand and watched his daughter talk fish biology at a 63-year-old man who listened with complete seriousness and asked follow-up questions that she took as their due. On the second evening, Vera made dinner and they ate at the kitchen table, the four of them, and the conversation moved from the woodpeckers to the lake to a documentary Lily had been watching about deep-sea ecosystems to Vera's years working overseas in a field she described generally as international logistics, and which Ethan understood to mean something else and didn't ask about. And by the end of it, Lily had decided that Vera was one of the most interesting adults she'd ever encountered, which she announced directly because she hadn't yet developed the filter that would eventually teach her to think things without saying them. Vera accepted this with a gravity that matched Lily's own. "Thank you," she said. "That's a meaningful thing to say." Lily nodded as if this were obvious and went back to her food. On the third morning, Ethan sat on the back porch in the early cold with coffee and his phone and called Victoria. She picked up on the third ring, which meant she'd been in a meeting and had excused herself to take it, because she'd told him she always let calls go to voicemail in meetings, unless they were from specific numbers, and apparently his was one of them. "Where are you?" she said. "Berkshires. We're heading back Sunday." "How is she?" "She found all 3 woodpecker species in the first 2 days," he said. "She's been going through Tom on fish ecology for 2 mornings. She's fine." A brief pause, and he could hear a smile in it, which was not something he'd have predicted from Victoria Hale 3 weeks ago. "Good," she said. And she meant that too. Not as a professional courtesy, not as the management of a situation, just the actual thing. "How's the building?" he said. "The new security team starts Monday. Greg Ferris is back from recovery, cleared for light duty, full duty in 3 weeks. The IT team got the budget increase you recommended, and they've been visibly gleeful about it, which I've decided is a good sign." She paused. "Dennis Holt resigned Thursday, before the federal investigators made contact, which means he knew it was coming. His lawyers reached out to Wynn's office Friday morning. He'll cooperate," Ethan said. "He's not a criminal. He was someone who got into something over his head and made it worse trying to get out." "That doesn't make it acceptable." "No," Ethan said. "It doesn't. But it makes it understandable, which is a different thing." Silence for a moment on her end. Then, "Kyle Merritt turned himself in Wednesday. His lawyer negotiated the terms. He'll cooperate fully with the federal investigation in exchange for a reduced charge." Another pause. "He's 23. "I know," Ethan said. "It's hard to be—" She stopped herself, which was the thing she did when she was being precise. "I'm angry about what he did, and I also understand how someone becomes the person who does it." She said this like she was surprised to find herself saying it, like the sentence had arrived before the permission for it had. "Yeah," Ethan said. "That's an uncomfortable place to stand." "It is," she said. "You seem used to it." "You get used to it," he said. "Not comfortable, just used to it." He could hear her thinking. It was a quality he'd noticed. The particular quality of silence from Victoria, when she was processing something genuinely, versus the silence that was decision-making. This was the first kind. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said. "About the decision on your last mission, the one you're still not sure was right." He hadn't expected that. "What about it?" "I've made decisions like that," she said. Not the same stakes, not the same context, but the kind where you're choosing between bad and worse with incomplete information, and afterward you have to live with not knowing if you chose right." She paused. "I pushed out a co-founder 4 years ago. His work on the early architecture was essential to what the company became. I thought he was going to destroy it, and I had evidence for that, and I made the call." Another pause. "He went on to build 2 other companies, both of which failed, which might mean I was right, or it might mean I created the conditions that made him fail afterward. I'll never know which." Ethan listened. "I used to spend a lot of time trying to calculate it backward," she said, "trying to construct the answer from the outcome. I've mostly stopped." "Why?" he said. "Because the backward calculation assumes the answer would change something," she said. "And I don't think it would. I made the best call I could with what I had. If it was wrong, I can't unmake it. What I can do is be more careful about the next one." A pause. "I don't know if that helps." "It does," he said. And it did, in the specific way that things help when they don't solve the problem, but accurately describe it. A small, real relief. Come back Sunday, she said. We have things to build. He looked out at the lake through the property's back trees, the morning light on the water, Tom pulling a rowboat up the small dock at the far end. Lily was going to be up soon and would want to go out before breakfast because the base bit better early, and she'd verified this empirically over 3 days and now treated it as settled fact. Sunday, he said. After he hung up, he sat for a while with his coffee, which was still warm, and thought about what she'd said. Not the logic of it, which he'd follow up on later, but the fact that she'd said it. Victoria Hale, who had built a billion-dollar company by being harder and faster and more precise than everyone around her, who had spent years presenting a surface so controlled that the people who worked for her forgot she was making it up as she went along like everyone else. She'd said something true about herself, to him, in the middle of a Friday morning, because it was relevant to something he was carrying and she'd decided that mattered. He thought about what it cost a person to do that. He thought he understood it better than most people would. The back door opened and Lily appeared in her pajamas and her sweatshirt, squinting at the morning light. The base aren't going to wait, she said. Tom's not even got the boat out yet, Ethan said. Then we should help him, she said, with the logic of someone who had decided the conclusion and was working backward to the premise. He finished his coffee and stood up and went to help with the boat. He started back at Hale Technologies on a Monday, 9 days after the second attack, in the same office that still smelled faintly of old paper and had the coverage map on the wall with its red marks, though fewer now, updated over the weekend by the IT team who'd already begun the infrastructure rebuild with the energy of people who'd been waiting a long time for the resources to do things right. The first week was dense. New security protocols to design, new camera coverage to specify, briefings with the incoming security team, a 3-hour session with the federal liaison that Wynn had assigned to Hale Technologies for the duration of the Vail prosecution. There was testimony to prepare, both his and Victoria's, and the legal team needed hours of his time to understand the operational detail of both nights in the building, and Greg Ferris came back on limited duty Thursday, and they spent an afternoon going through the gaps in the previous security architecture with the specific honesty of two people who knew where the failures were and weren't protecting anyone's feelings about it. The freight elevator, Ferris said on that Thursday afternoon. Yeah. I should have caught that. The access pattern on the vendor log. It was designed to be invisible, Ethan said. Someone who knew your team's review process designed around it. He paused. What you can do now is build a review process that's harder to design around. That's what matters. Ferris looked at him for a moment. He was a good man. Ethan had assessed that on the night of the first attack, watching him go down trying to protect Victoria, and nothing since had changed the assessment. You're more generous about this than I expected, Ferris said. I'm practical about it, Ethan said. Generous is different. Is it? Ethan thought about it. Maybe not always, he said. Ferris almost smiled. I'm glad you're here, he said. And I don't just mean, he gestured at the office, the building. I mean it in general. Ethan nodded. He accepted it without deflecting, which was something he'd been working on. Victoria had a habit of working late. Not every night, she'd told him once, in the sideways way she mentioned personal things, that she'd learned to manage that after a period in the company's 3rd year when she'd looked up and realized she'd worked 90-hour weeks for 6 months straight and couldn't remember the last time she'd talked to anyone about something that wasn't the company. She'd built guardrails. They weren't perfect guardrails, but she maintained them. Still, there were nights when the building was mostly empty and her light was on at the end of the hall, and sometimes on those nights Ethan would still be at his own desk, and they'd end up in the kitchen on the 41st floor, which had a better coffee maker than most of the building and a window that looked east over the city instead of down at the street. 3 weeks after he came back, on one of those nights, she said, I owe you an apology. He looked up from his coffee. For what? The termination letter, she said. She paused, which was the pause of someone who'd had a speech prepared and was deciding to set it aside. I reviewed the decision the week after the attack. Not the process. The process was correct. The vendor contract economics were what they were. But I reviewed how I made it. She held her cup in both hands. I signed your name off a list without knowing who you were. I'd employed you for 14 months, and I couldn't have told you anything about you. And that... She stopped again. That's not something I can justify as efficiency. That's something else. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I wasn't easy to know, he said. I didn't put myself in front of you. That's not, she shook her head. That's not the point. The maintenance supervisor isn't responsible for making himself visible to the CEO. That's exactly backward. She looked at him. I ran this company for years in a way that optimized for output and treated the people producing it as, she paused, precise, looking for the right word. Variables. Mostly interchangeable, mostly in the background, notable when they caused a problem. And now? He said. She was quiet for a second. Now I'm aware of it, she said, which is not the same as fixed, but it's where fixed starts. He nodded slowly. The apology is accepted, he said. For what it's worth, I didn't take it personally at the time. It was a business decision. I'd seen enough of them. Did you take it personally later? She said. He looked at her. She was watching him directly, the way she did when she actually wanted the answer. A little, he said. When I was in that mechanical room and you called the police and I went back out into the building and I thought, yeah, maybe briefly I thought about the letter. He paused. And then I didn't because there were people who needed to get to a stairwell. She looked down at her coffee. You went back out anyway. People needed to get to a stairwell, he said again. That's not a complete explanation, she said. He thought about it honestly. No, he said. It's not. She didn't push it. She seemed to understand that some things had more than one reason, and not all of them could be extracted cleanly, and she was smart enough not to need the complete theory when the demonstrated fact was already clear. They sat in the 41st floor kitchen with the city going east through the window, and it was the comfortable kind of quiet that takes time to build between people. Not the absence of things to say, but the presence of enough ease that silence didn't need to be filled. Lily's school has a family lunch thing on Fridays, Ethan said. Victoria looked at him. He was looking at the window. I know, she said. You mentioned it. I was thinking... He stopped, started again. She's been asking about you, since the Berkshires. She knows what the last few weeks involved, in general terms, and she knows your name, and she has opinions about you. What kind of opinions? She thinks you must be interesting, he said, because Vera told her you'd offered the house, and Lily said... He paused, something moving in his expression that was between amusement and a more complicated feeling. She said anyone who had a secret house was probably interesting. Victoria made the sound that was almost a laugh, but arrived before she pulled it back. That's a specific criterion, she said. She has specific criteria for most things. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I'd like to meet her, she said. If that's something you'd want. He looked at her. Friday lunch, he said. If you're free. I'll make it free, she said. He nodded. He looked back at the window. Outside, the city ran in all its directions, 41 floors below, and there was nothing in it that required anything from him tonight. No alarm, no surveillance, no threat mapping. Just the ordinary machinery of a place with too many people in it trying to get through their days, which was the best kind of environment, the one he'd been trying to find his way back to for 3 years. He had understood, somewhere in the middle of those 3 weeks, that the story he'd been telling himself about his life was missing a piece. The story was, he had been a soldier. The soldier had done things that cost too much. He had left and become a father and tried to be ordinary, and the past had found him anyway, as it does, because the past doesn't care about the story you're telling yourself. That was true as far as it went. But it was missing the part that said what came next, and he'd been living in the absence of that part for 3 years. Just the negative space where the next chapter was supposed to be, filling it with the maintenance work and the school lunches and the nature documentaries and the good, necessary, not quite sufficient work of being present for Lily. What he understood now was that the chapter wasn't separate from the ordinariness. It wasn't a replacement for it. It was built out of the same material. The school lunches, the early mornings, the woodpecker species, and the base in the lake, and the conversations in the 41st floor kitchen, but assembled into a shape that included other people. Not just Lily, who had always been there, but people who came in sideways and turned out to be real. He'd spent 3 years trying to build a wall between who he'd been and who he was trying to be. And what the last 3 weeks had shown him was that the wall was the wrong structure. You couldn't wall off the parts of yourself that made you useful in a crisis, because those were the same parts that made you pay attention when a child needed something, that made you stay in a building when everyone else was leaving, that made you say last chance to a man who didn't know you well enough to understand what that meant. You just had to be careful what you aimed it at. He was sitting in the maintenance room on the 38th floor, his old maintenance room, the one he still came to sometimes when he needed to think in a space that wasn't his office, when Victoria found him a week later. She didn't ask what he was doing there. She came and sat on the workbench across from him, which was not a comfortable surface, and she didn't comment on that either. Park finished the final analysis on the Vail Network's communication records, she said. There are 3 more cutout companies they're unwinding. It'll take months, but Wynn says the prosecution's case gets stronger every week. Good, he said. Kyle Merritt's cooperation has been significant, apparently. He knew more about the secondary layer than anyone expected. She paused. Wynn says he seems genuinely relieved, that he'd been in it for 8 months and spent most of that time trying to figure out how to get out. Ethan nodded. He'd thought about Kyle Merritt more than he'd expected to. This 23-year-old kid who'd been found by the right person at the wrong moment, who'd made a series of decisions that each seemed smaller than they were until they added up to something he couldn't undo alone. He thought about the kind of loneliness that makes a person vulnerable to being found like that. He thought about how you built the kind of life that made you less findable that way, and whether that was something you could choose or just something that happened to you depending on where you landed. He's going to need something to do after, Ethan said. Something real. Victoria looked at him. He looked back. I'm not saying, he paused. It's not my call. I'm just noting that people who cooperate with federal investigations and have competency in building systems access don't always have a clear path forward, and sometimes a clear path forward is the difference between someone who rebuilds and someone who doesn't. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Are you recommending him for a position? I'm noting a fact, Ethan said. What you do with it is your call. She held his gaze for a long second, then, I'll think about it. He nodded. They sat in the maintenance room, which still smelled like the building's bones, old concrete and pipe insulation, and outside the small window that looked onto the service alley, the afternoon was doing what October afternoons did, going golden and early toward dark. Can I ask you something? Victoria said. Yeah. Why did you stay? After the letter. You had no obligation to stay, you had every reason to go home, and yet you were in the electrical room at 6:40 doing a diagnostic on a sensor that had been on a watch list all day. She looked at him. Nobody would have known. He thought about this honestly. I would have known, he said. That's the whole answer? The sensor failing during a 200-person event would have taken out environmental controls on 3 floors, he said. Someone would have noticed that eventually, but not before a lot of people were uncomfortable, and the event was disrupted and the building looked incompetent. He paused. It was my job. The letter didn't change that it was my job until end of business Friday. Most people would have said the letter changed it, she said. I know, he said. I'm not most people. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. You're really not. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more precise than a compliment. An observation, delivered with the accuracy she brought to most things, and he received it in kind. Neither are you, he said. She looked at him for a moment with that expression he'd been cataloging for a month now, the one that moved through several registers too fast to track completely. Then she looked at the window. Friday, she said. Friday, he confirmed. She stood up from the workbench, which involved a brief acknowledgement that it was not a comfortable surface, and went back out into the building. He heard the service door close behind her. He sat alone in the maintenance room for a while longer. The building hummed around him. The sensor array he'd been called here to watch 14 months ago and 3 weeks ago and always was doing what sensors did when they were working right, reading accurately, reporting honestly, telling the system what was actually there rather than what the system expected to find. He thought about what it meant to read accurately, to see what was actually there. He'd spent years thinking it was a military skill, something that belonged to a version of him he'd retired. But it was just a way of paying attention, and you could pay attention anywhere, in a combat zone, or a service corridor, or a kitchen on the 41st floor, or a lake in the Berkshires where the base bit better in the mornings, and a small girl with a field guide was building her own meticulous picture of the world. He'd been the man nobody noticed for 3 years because he'd chosen it. He'd made himself invisible as an act of protection. Protect Lily. Protect the quiet life. Protect the distance between the soldier and the father. What he understood now, in the maintenance room where this had started, was that the distance had been a kind of loss as much as a protection. You couldn't protect people you loved by disappearing. You protected them by being fully present, with all of it: the history, the skills, the damage, the capability, and aiming it at the right things. He'd been aiming wrong. Not badly, not harmfully, just narrowly. The past few weeks had widened the aim. He stood up. His ribs had mostly stopped hurting, which was a mercy. His shoulder was almost right. The scar above his eye was fading to the thin line it would probably always be, which was fine. He'd earned it doing something worth doing. On Friday, he drove to Lily's school at noon and signed in at the front desk the way he always did, and he found her table in the cafeteria the way he always did, and he sat across from her with the noise of 200 children around them, and she was in the middle of explaining to him why the classification of a specific genus of freshwater fish had been revised by researchers, and why this mattered, and why the old field guides were therefore technically incorrect on several points. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without looking at his phone, tracking every detail because this was his daughter, and what she said mattered and had always mattered. Victoria arrived 8 minutes later. She stood at the cafeteria entrance for a moment. This woman who commanded conference rooms and handled federal agents and ran a billion-dollar company, standing slightly uncertain at the edge of an elementary school cafeteria, looking for them. Ethan raised his hand. She saw him and came across the room, navigating the tables and the running children with care, and she sat down in the third chair. Lily stopped mid-sentence and looked at her with the full, unfiltered assessment that she applied to all new people. Victoria looked back at her steadily, and didn't reach for pleasantries, and didn't talk down, and just said, "You're Lily." "Yes," Lily said. "You're Victoria." "Yes." Lily studied her for another second. "Vera said you let us use your house." "Yes," Victoria said. "It has good woodpeckers," Lily said. "I know," Victoria said. "Tom told me you found all 3 species." Lily seemed to find this response appropriate. "The pileated is nesting in the east stand," she said. "We're fairly certain." "That's significant," Victoria said, with complete seriousness. Lily looked at her for one more moment, running whatever calculation she ran, and apparently found it satisfactory, because she said, "Do you want to hear about the fish taxonomy revision?" "Yes," Victoria said, and she meant it, or she did a good enough job of meaning it that Lily accepted it without interrogation, which was the same thing in practical terms. Ethan sat across from the two of them and drank his terrible cafeteria coffee and listened to his daughter explain fish taxonomy to a CEO who was listening with the focus she applied to things that mattered. And the noise of the cafeteria was around them in that particular way of school cafeteria noise, chaotic and warm and full of the ordinary business of children being alive. And he thought about what Lily had said in the Berkshires, about the pileated woodpecker and its mating habits. That's a long time to be with someone. She hadn't been talking about woodpeckers. He'd known it then, and he knew it now. And he sat with the knowledge the way he sat with most things that mattered, quietly, without rushing it, letting it be what it was. He had survived the battlefield. He had survived the years after it. He had survived 3 weeks of a past that came back to find him, and he had ended it the way he'd ended the mission that started it. Not cleanly, not perfectly, but completely. With the cost absorbed and the thing done. What came after the surviving was the part nobody talked about much. It didn't have the drama of the rest of it. It didn't announce itself. It was just a Friday afternoon in a school cafeteria with bad coffee and a child who had opinions about fish and a woman who was learning, the same as he was, what it meant to let someone into the parts of your life you'd kept locked because locked felt safer than the alternative. The alternative was this. He'd thought for 3 years that the hardest thing he'd ever done was the mission. The call in the field. The decision with incomplete information and everything on the line. He'd been wrong. The hardest thing was what came after, the choice to still be present, the choice to let the walls down far enough that something could get in and matter. The choice to drive 400 miles to pick up your daughter and feel every mile of the distance because she was everything, and to sit in a kitchen on the 41st floor at midnight and be honest about something uncomfortable because the person across from you was worth being honest with. The hardest thing was choosing to stay, not in the building, the night of the attack, not in the city when the threat came, but in the life, all the way in it, with all of himself, aimed at the right things. I was still learning how to do that. He expected he'd be learning it for a while. Lily had moved on from fish taxonomy to woodpecker nesting behavior, which Victoria was following with apparent genuine interest, asking questions that Lily approved of, judging by the increasing engagement in her expression. Outside the cafeteria windows, the October afternoon was doing what it did, going golden, going early, the light at that particular angle that made everything look like it was worth keeping. Ethan drank his bad coffee and watched his daughter and thought, without sentimentality but with complete accuracy, that this was what he'd been fighting for. Not the mission, not the technology, not the resolution of a threat that should have ended 3 years ago and hadn't. This specific afternoon, this cafeteria, these two people. It wasn't a simple life. It was never going to be a simple life. But it was his, and it was real, and it was, for the first time in longer than he could honestly say, entirely enough.